The raging waters pulled at her dress, dragging her deeper into the darkness. Abigail Reed's lungs burned as she struggled against the current, her arms flailing uselessly against the torrent. Fragments of memories flashed before her eyes, her mother's gentle smile, the mocking laughter of men, and the contorted crimson face of the man who had thrown her into these waters, the man who was supposed to protect her. Thunder cracked overhead, illuminating the churning river for a brief, terrible moment. Rain lashed down, merging with the floodwaters that had already swollen the banks. Abigail's strength was fading. Her torn dress tangled around her legs like chains pulling her further into the abyss. Perhaps this is for the best, she thought, as her consciousness began to slip away. Perhaps this is where the pain finally ends. Just as darkness began to envelop her, something broke through the surface above. A hand, strong, weathered, and determined, plunged into the waters and grabbed her arm. The grip was firm, unyielding, as if it refused to let death claim her. Abigail felt herself being pulled upward, breaking through the surface into the howling wind and rain. As consciousness faded, she caught a glimpse of her savior, a man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held their own kind of storm. Then darkness claimed her. The morning sun cast long shadows across Redemption Valley, Montana. The year was 1877, 12 years after the Civil War had torn the nation apart, and still the wounds had not fully healed. This was especially true in places like Redemption, where former soldiers from both sides had settled, bringing their ghosts and grudges with them. Abigail Reed stood behind the bar of the Silver Dollar Saloon, wiping glasses with a worn cloth. At 22, her beauty was both a blessing and a curse in a frontier town. Her chestnut hair was tied back in a practical bun, but a few stubborn strands had escaped to frame a face that turned heads wherever she went. Her eyes, a deep blue, that reminded old-timers of mountain lakes, were fixed on her work, deliberately avoiding the gazes that followed her movements. The saloon was the largest establishment in Redemption Valley, owned by her stepfather, Jeremiah Sullivan. A former Confederate lieutenant, Sullivan had returned from the war a changed man, bitter about the South's defeat, and determined to carve out his own kingdom in the West. The Silver Dollar was his castle, a place where gambling, drinking, and other less savory activities put money in his pockets and power in his hands. "Abigail," Sullivan's voice cut through the quiet morning. "Where's the whiskey inventory?" Abigail set down the glass she was polishing. "In your office, sir." Left side of the desk, like always. Sullivan emerged from the back room, his imposing figure filling the doorway. He was a tall man with hard features weathered by sun and hardship. A jagged scar ran down the side of his neck, a souvenir from Gettysburg. His blue-green eyes, once described as captivating by Abigail's mother, now often held a cold, calculating look, especially when business was concerned. "Pour me a drink," he ordered, settling at the bar. Though it was barely past 9 in the morning, Abigail knew better than to question him. She poured 2 fingers of whiskey and slid the glass across the polished wood. Sullivan downed it in one swallow, then pushed the glass back for a refill. "We've got Reed and his boys coming in tonight." Abigail's hand faltered momentarily as she reached for the bottle. Silas Reed was notorious throughout the territory, a ruthless outlaw whose gang had terrorized stagecoaches and settlements from Montana to Wyoming. They were also Sullivan's most valued customers and occasional business partners. "I'll make sure the private room is ready," she said, keeping her voice steady. Sullivan studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Do that, and wear the blue dress tonight. Reed likes it." Abigail felt a chill run down her spine, but nodded obediently. The blue dress was cut lower than she preferred, a gift from Sullivan that made his intentions clear. She was part of the entertainment, an attraction to keep men drinking and gambling. As Sullivan retreated to his office, Abigail's mind drifted to a different time before her mother's death, 5 years ago. There had been moments, brief as they were, when Sullivan had shown a different side. When her mother Clara was alive, he had been almost gentle, bringing gifts from his trips, and even laughing occasionally at the dinner table. He wasn't always like this, Clara had told her once when Abigail had questioned why her mother had married such a hard man. The war changed many men, Abby. Some wounds don't show on the outside. But after Clara succumbed to consumption, those glimpses of humanity had vanished. Sullivan had retreated into a shell of bitterness, drowning his sorrows in whiskey, and turning his business interests toward increasingly questionable ventures. The bell above the saloon door jangled, pulling Abigail from her thoughts. It was only Walter, the elderly piano player, coming in to practice before the evening rush. "Morning, Miss Abby," he said with a tip of his hat. "Storm coming in tonight, they say. Might be a rough one." Abigail smiled at the old man. "Seems there's always a storm coming these days, Walter." As the first notes of Walter's practice filled the empty saloon, Abigail returned to her chores, but her mind was elsewhere. In 3 days, the monthly supply wagon would leave for San Francisco. She had been saving for months, hiding coins in a small leather pouch buried beneath a loose floorboard in her room. Soon, she would have enough for passage west, away from Redemption Valley, and the life that had become her prison. The late afternoon sun slipped behind thick, dark clouds as Abigail made her way to the small cemetery on the edge of town. It was her weekly ritual, weather permitting, to visit her mother's grave and bring fresh wildflowers. The cemetery sat on a gentle slope overlooking the valley, one of the few peaceful places in Redemption. Most of the markers were simple wooden crosses, the names already fading from sun and rain. Clara Reed's grave was marked by a modest stone, one of the few in the cemetery paid for by Sullivan in what Abigail had recognized as a final act of genuine grief. Kneeling beside the grave, Abigail arranged the wildflowers in the small tin vase she had placed there months ago. "Hello, Mama," she whispered, touching the cool stone. "Storm's coming tonight. Big one from the look of those clouds." The wind picked up, sending her skirt fluttering around her ankles. "I'm close now, Mama. Close to having enough to leave." Abigail's voice dropped even lower, though there was no one to hear her in the deserted cemetery. "Just a little more time, and I'll be on my way to San Francisco, just like we always talked about." She traced the carved letters of her mother's name. Clara Reed, beloved mother, 1830–1872. "I wish you could have come with me," Abigail continued, her voice catching. "We could have had that little seamstress shop by the bay. Remember how you used to describe it, with blue curtains and a bell over the door?" A distant rumble of thunder answered her, and Abigail glanced at the darkening sky. She should head back soon, before the rain began. "I have to go, Mama. Sullivan wants me to serve Reed and his gang tonight." Her jaw tightened. "But soon I won't have to do what Sullivan wants anymore. Soon I'll be free." Rising to her feet, Abigail pressed her fingers to her lips, then touched them to the top of the gravestone. "I'll come back before I leave," she promised, to say goodbye properly. As she made her way back toward town, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, and the wind carried the distant howl of a wolf from the mountains. Abigail pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, quickening her pace. There was something ominous in the air tonight, something beyond the approaching storm. She had no way of knowing just how right she was. The Silver Dollar Saloon hummed with activity as evening fell. The promised storm had arrived with a vengeance, driving men indoors to seek shelter, companionship, and liquid warmth. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder occasionally drowned out the piano music and raucous laughter. Abigail moved efficiently between tables delivering drinks and deflecting wandering hands with practiced ease. She wore the blue dress Sullivan had insisted upon, though she'd managed to pin the neckline slightly higher than he preferred. Her hair was arranged in loose curls down her back, another of Sullivan's requirements for the evening. She was acutely aware of the eyes that followed her, particularly those belonging to Sheriff Wallace Monroe, who sat at his usual corner table. Monroe had been eyeing her since she turned 16, his interest barely concealed behind his badge and wedding ring. As a former Confederate soldier like Sullivan Monroe had found a comfortable position of authority in Redemption Valley, where his selective enforcement of the law benefited men like himself. Sullivan stood at the bar unusually tense as he repeatedly checked the large pocket watch he kept in his vest. It was nearly 9, and Reed's gang was late. "Maybe the storm delayed them," Abigail suggested as she returned to the bar for another round of drinks. Sullivan shot her a warning glance. "They'll be here. Reed doesn't miss a chance to play cards, especially when he's flush from a job." The implication was clear. Reed and his gang had recently robbed someone, and Sullivan expected to relieve them of their ill-gotten gains at the poker table. It was a dangerous game he played doing business with outlaws, but one that had made him wealthy by frontier standards. The saloon doors suddenly burst open, bringing with them a gust of wind and rain. Conversation momentarily halted as 4 men entered, water streaming from their slickers and hats. At their center was Silas Reed himself, a lean, predatory figure with a face marked by a distinctive scar that ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth. "Sullivan!" Reed called out, his voice carrying over the resumed noise of the saloon. "Hope you've got something stronger than this rain to warm a man's insides." Sullivan's demeanor changed instantly, a practiced smile replacing his scowl. "Reed, beginning to think the storm washed you boys away." He gestured to the bar. "First round's on the house." Reed and his men, a collection of hard-faced individuals known collectively as the Reed Four, made their way to the bar. Their reputation preceded them. Cole Dunham, a sharpshooter who could reportedly hit a playing card at 50 paces. Brothers Liam and Patrick Walsh, former Union deserters with a penchant for unnecessary violence, and Reed himself, the brains and brutality behind their operations. Abigail felt her stomach tighten as Reed's gaze fell upon her, his eyes lingering on the neckline of her dress. "Well now, if it isn't Sullivan's little songbird, still keeping her caged up, Jeremiah." Sullivan forced a laugh. "Abigail, pour Mr. Reed and his associates their drinks, then show them to the private room. Everything set up as requested." Abigail nodded, reaching for the top-shelf whiskey. As she poured, Reed leaned across the bar close enough that she could smell the mixture of rain horse and tobacco on him. "That's a mighty pretty dress, Miss Reed," he said, his voice low. "Brings out the color of your eyes." "Thank you, Mr. Reed," she replied mechanically, sliding the glasses across the bar. "Heard tell you sing sometimes," Reed continued, making no move to take his drink. "Might you favor us with a song later?" Before Abigail could respond, Sullivan interjected. "Abigail has many talents, Reed. Perhaps you can discuss them over cards." He clapped the outlaw on the shoulder, steering him toward the back room. "Gentlemen, shall we?" Reed allowed himself to be guided away, but not before giving Abigail a look that made her skin crawl. She released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and continued with her duties, trying to ignore the sense of foreboding that had settled over her. Hours passed, and the storm outside intensified. The regular patrons gradually departed as midnight approached, leaving only the most dedicated drinkers, Sheriff Monroe among them. Abigail was wiping down tables when Sullivan emerged from the private room, his face flushed with a dangerous mixture of whiskey and anger. "Abigail," he called, his voice too controlled. "Bring another bottle of the good stuff." She retrieved the bottle and followed him back to the private room where the air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Cards and money were spread across the green felt table, and from the sullen look on Sullivan's face and the pile of cash in front of Reed, it was clear who was winning. "Ah, the lovely Miss Reed returns," Reed said, leaning back in his chair. "And with salvation in a bottle, no less." Abigail set the whiskey on the table and turned to leave, but Sullivan's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. "Stay," he ordered. Something in his tone made her blood run cold. She glanced at the table and saw what she had missed. At first, Sullivan's pocket watch, his prized gold rings, and a folded document that looked suspiciously like a deed. "You've lost more than you can afford," Reed observed, shuffling the cards with practiced ease. "But I'm a reasonable man, Sullivan. Perhaps we can come to an alternative arrangement." Sullivan's grip on Abigail's wrist tightened painfully. "I have other assets." Reed's eyes flicked to Abigail, then back to Sullivan. "Indeed you do, but are you willing to part with them?" The implication hung in the air, heavy as the storm clouds outside. Abigail felt a surge of fear, then anger. She had long suspected that Sullivan saw her as property, but to have it confirmed so blatantly was still a shock. "I am not part of any game," she said firmly, trying to pull away from Sullivan's grasp. Sullivan rose suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us for a moment." He dragged Abigail from the room down the hall and into his office, slamming the door behind them. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his face inches from hers. "I won't be traded like cattle," Abigail retorted, her fear giving way to outrage. "Not to Reed or anyone else." Sullivan released her with a small shove, running a hand through his hair. For a moment, he looked almost anguished. "You don't understand. I'm in deep, Abigail. Reed holds markers I can't possibly pay." "That's not my concern," she said, rubbing her wrist where his fingers had left red marks. "It became your concern the moment your mother died and left you in my care." Sullivan snapped, then seemed to regret his outburst. His voice softened slightly. "Reed's proposing you work off my debt, serving in his establishments over in Helena." Abigail recoiled. "His establishments? You mean his brothels? How dare you even consider such a thing?" "It would only be for a time," Sullivan insisted, not meeting her eyes. "Until the debt is cleared." "And how long would that be?" "Months, years." Abigail felt tears of anger threatening to spill, but forced them back. "I am not for sale, Sullivan. Not to cover your gambling debts, not for any reason." Sullivan's expression hardened. "You've lived under my roof, eaten my food, worn clothes I paid for. You owe me, girl." "I've worked for everything I've received," Abigail countered. "I've served in your saloon, kept your books, endured the hands and eyes of your patrons. I owe you nothing." For a moment, something like shame flickered across Sullivan's face, quickly replaced by the cold mask he typically wore. "This isn't a negotiation. Reed has offered to clear my debt in exchange for your services. I've accepted." Abigail felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No, I won't go with him. I'll run, you'll do as you're told." Sullivan grabbed her arm again, pulling her toward the door. "This is happening, Abigail. Best make peace with it." He dragged her back to the private room where Reed and his men waited with expectant expressions. Abigail's mind raced, calculating distances to the door, wondering if she could break free and escape into the storm. Even the raging elements seemed preferable to the fate Sullivan had arranged for her. "Well?" Reed asked, eyebrow raised. Sullivan pushed Abigail forward. "She's yours. The debt is cleared." Reed smiled, revealing a gold tooth among otherwise yellowed ones. "Excellent. She'll start tomorrow at my establishment in Helena. I'm sure she'll be popular." "No," Abigail said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I will not." Reed's smile faltered. "Pardon." "I said no." Abigail straightened her spine, looking directly at the outlaw. "I am not property to be traded. I will not go with you, not tomorrow, not ever." A dangerous silence fell over the room. Reed's men exchanged glances, clearly not accustomed to being refused. Reed leaned forward, his scar more prominent in the lamplight. "Sullivan, it appears your asset requires some convincing." Sullivan's face had turned a dangerous shade of red, a vein pulsing at his temple. Whether from embarrassment, rage, or both, Abigail couldn't tell. "Abigail," he growled, "you will do as you're told. Or what?" She challenged a lifetime of suppressed defiance, finally breaking free. "What more can you take from me, Sullivan? You've already sold my future to cover your weakness." The slap came swiftly, the sound cracking like the thunder outside. Abigail's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning from the impact. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. Reed and his men laughed, entertained by the display. "Spirited," Reed commented. "I like that. Makes breaking them more satisfying." Something in Abigail snapped. With a swift movement, she grabbed an empty whiskey bottle from the table and smashed it against the edge, leaving her holding a jagged weapon. When Cole Dunham reached for her, she slashed outward, catching him across the arm. He howled in pain, blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. "You little wildcat!" Reed exclaimed, more amused than angered. Abigail backed toward the door, holding the broken bottle before her. "Stay back," she warned, her voice shaking slightly. "All of you." Sullivan moved toward her, his expression thunderous. "Abigail, put that down before you make things worse." "Worse? How could this possibly be worse?" She continued, edging toward the door. "You sold me, Sullivan, like I was nothing, like my mother would have wanted this for me." At the mention of her mother, something flashed in Sullivan's eyes, pain, perhaps, or guilt, but it was quickly replaced by cold fury. "Your mother would understand necessity. Clara always did." "Don't you dare speak her name," Abigail spat. "You're not fit to mention her." She reached the door and fumbled for the handle behind her, keeping the broken bottle extended. The moment it opened, she turned and ran, dashing through the nearly empty saloon and out into the storm. The rain hit her like a physical blow, instantly soaking through the thin blue dress. Thunder boomed overhead, and lightning split the sky briefly, illuminating the muddy street. Abigail ran blindly, her only thought to put distance between herself and the silver dollar. Behind her, she heard Sullivan's voice bellowing her name, followed by the sound of multiple boots splashing through puddles. She darted between buildings, heading instinctively toward the edge of town, where the river marked the boundary of Redemption Valley. The normally placid river had transformed into a roaring torrent, swollen with rainwater from the mountains. Abigail paused at the bank, realizing she had run into a dead end. To cross would be suicide in these conditions, but to turn back meant facing Sullivan and Reed. "Abigail?" Sullivan's voice carried over the storm as he appeared through the curtain of rain alone. He must have outpaced Reed and the others. "Stop this foolishness right now." She backed away, still clutching the broken bottle. "Stay away from me." Sullivan advanced, his face a mask of rage and something else, fear. You've embarrassed me for the last time, girl. Do you have any idea what Reed will do now? He'll take you anyway and kill me for the insult. That's not my concern, Abigail repeated her earlier words, rain mixing with tears on her face. Everything I've done has been for your own good, Sullivan insisted, moving closer. Everything, and this is how you repay me. My own good, Abigail laughed bitterly. You were going to sell me to a man who runs brothels. How is that for my own good? Sullivan was close enough now that she could see the raindrops streaming down his face, plastering his graying hair to his forehead. Reed would have kept you safe, protected. And now, he broke off, glancing over his shoulder as distant figures appeared through the rain. Now it's too late. Abigail followed his gaze and saw Reed and his men approaching, moving with the unhurried confidence of predators who know their prey is cornered. Please, Abigail whispered, a desperate appeal to whatever humanity might remain in her stepfather. Please, Sullivan, don't do this. For a moment, something shifted in Sullivan's expression, a flicker of the man he might once have been. Then his eyes hardened as he looked back at the approaching figures. I'm sorry, Abigail, he said, and for an instant she thought he might help her escape. Instead, he lunged forward, knocking the broken bottle from her hand and grabbing her by the waist. Before she could process what was happening, Sullivan had lifted her off her feet. No! Abigail screamed, struggling against his grip. Sullivan! No! Please, I'm begging you. Their eyes met one last time, and in Sullivan's gaze, Abigail saw a terrible mixture of rage, shame, and resignation. Then he threw her into the raging river. The shock of the cold water drove the air from Abigail's lungs. The current immediately seized her, pulling her under and tumbling her like a rag doll. Her sodden dress wrapped around her legs, hampering her already feeble attempts to swim. She broke the surface once, gasping for air, and caught a glimpse of Sullivan standing on the bank, his figure illuminated by a flash of lightning, watching as the river carried her away. Then she was under again, the roar of the water filling her ears, her lungs burning for air. As consciousness began to fade, Abigail thought of her mother, of the dreams they had shared, of the future that was slipping away with each passing second. I'm sorry, Mama, she thought, as darkness encroached. I tried to be strong. Just as she was about to surrender to the inevitable, something solid gripped her arm, pulling against the current. Through the watery haze, she saw a man plunging into the river, his silver-streaked hair plastered to his head, determination etched on his weathered face. With a strength born of desperation, he dragged her toward the surface, toward air, toward life. The last thing Abigail remembered before unconsciousness claimed her was being carried in strong arms, rain falling on her face, and a deep voice saying words she couldn't quite make out. Then, nothing. Samuel Blackwood had not planned to visit town that evening. At 57, he preferred the solitude of his ranch to the noise and complications of Redemption Valley. But supplies had run low, and the approaching storm had forced his hand. Better to endure a quick trip now than be stranded for days if the rain washed out the roads. He had just finished loading his wagon with flour, coffee, and other necessities when the storm broke in earnest. Cursing his luck, Samuel had urged his horses homeward, hoping to reach his ranch before the worst hit. He had almost made it, too, when a flash of lightning illuminated the river bend near his property and revealed a scene that stopped him cold. A man, Jeremiah Sullivan, he realized with a jolt of recognition, standing at the riverbank, throwing something into the churning waters. No, not something. Someone. Samuel had reacted without thinking, pulling his wagon to a halt and racing toward the river. By the time he reached the bank, Sullivan was gone, but a pale shape struggled briefly in the water before disappearing beneath the surface. Again, Samuel acted on instinct. Shrugging off his coat, he plunged into the frigid water, fighting the current that threatened to sweep him away as well. Years of ranch work had kept him strong despite his age, but even so, the river nearly claimed him before his searching hands found fabric, then an arm. The woman for it was a woman he now saw was barely conscious, her eyes fluttering as he dragged her to shore. Samuel gathered her in his arms, noting with alarm how cold she felt, how blue her lips had become in just minutes. His ranch house was closer than town, and with Sullivan potentially still nearby, Samuel made the decision quickly. He carried the woman to his wagon, wrapping her in the dry blanket he kept beneath the seat, and set off for home at a pace that threatened to overturn them in the muddy road. Now, 3 days later, Samuel sat beside his bed, where the woman still lay, her breathing finally steady after a dangerous fever had broken during the night. He had done what he could, changed her into one of his old shirts, kept her warm spooned broth between her lips when she was lucid enough to swallow. But it had been touch and go with the fever taking hold the second day and raging through her system like wildfire. In the quiet moments between tending to her, Samuel had studied her face, trying to place why she seemed vaguely familiar. She was beautiful, certainly, even in her current state, high cheekbones, a delicate nose, full lips now chapped from fever. But it was her hair, a rich chestnut spread across his pillow, that nagged at his memory. He had seen that exact shade before, on another woman long ago. Rising from his chair beside the bed, Samuel moved to the trunk at the foot of his spare bed. It contained the few personal items he had kept from his previous life, before Redemption Valley, before the war, before he had lost everything that mattered. From beneath carefully folded uniforms and letters, he withdrew a small wooden box. Inside, protected by a square of faded silk, was a daguerreotype in a simple frame. The image showed a young woman with the same chestnut hair as his patient, her expression serious as the photography process had required, but with a hint of smile in her eyes. Samuel turned the frame over. On the back, in his own handwriting, were the words, Clara, 1855. The resemblance was uncanny, too strong to be coincidence. This young woman must be related to Clara somehow. A niece, perhaps, or a daughter. The thought struck Samuel like a physical blow. Clara had been with child when she disappeared from his life. He had assumed both mother and child had perished in the fire that claimed his home during the early days of the war. But if this young woman was indeed Clara's daughter, then Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he returned the photograph to its box. He was jumping to conclusions based on a mere resemblance. There could be many explanations. A soft moan from the bed interrupted his thoughts. The woman was stirring her eyelids, fluttering open, to reveal eyes of the deepest blue, Clara's eyes. Where? Her voice was barely a whisper, raspy from disuse. You're safe, Samuel said, returning to the bedside. You're at my ranch about 3 miles outside of Redemption Valley. I'm Samuel Blackwood. The woman tried to sit up, then winced and fell back against the pillows. The river, she murmured. I remember the river. Samuel nodded. You nearly drowned. I pulled you out 3 nights ago. Her eyes widened as memory returned. Sullivan, she gasped. He threw me in. He was going to sell me to Reed. Samuel's jaw tightened at the confirmation of what he had witnessed. Jeremiah Sullivan, the saloon owner. My stepfather, she replied, her voice gaining strength. I'm Abigail. Abigail Reed. Reed, not Sullivan. Another piece that fit the emerging puzzle. You've been very ill, Miss Reed, a severe fever. But I believe the worst has passed. Abigail's gaze darted around the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the medical supplies on the bedside table, and finally, Samuel himself. "You're a doctor." "I was once," Samuel admitted. "Army surgeon for the Union during the war. Now I just ranch, mostly." At the mention of the Union, a flicker of apprehension crossed Abigail's face. Sullivan was Confederate, lieutenant under General Lee. "I'm aware," Samuel said, his tone neutral, "but the war's been over for 12 years. Those divisions mean little to me now." Abigail seemed to relax slightly, though wariness remained in her posture. "Why did you help me? You don't know me." Samuel considered his answer carefully. "I saw a person in need. The river would have killed you." "Maybe that would have been better," Abigail whispered almost to herself. "No life is so without hope that death becomes preferable," Samuel replied firmly. "Whatever troubles led you to that river, they can be faced." Abigail laughed bitterly, then winced at the pain it caused. "You don't know Sullivan or Reed. They won't stop looking for me." "Perhaps not," Samuel conceded, "but you're safe for now. You need rest and time to recover." Abigail studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. Finally, she nodded slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, for saving me." "Samuel, please." He stood gathering the bowl and cloth he had used to cool her fever. "There's broth warming on the stove. Do you think you could manage some?" Abigail nodded again, and Samuel moved to the kitchen area of his small ranch house. As he ladled the simple broth into a bowl, his mind returned to the photograph in the wooden box to Clara, to the suspicion forming in his mind. If Abigail was indeed Clara's daughter, born after Clara had vanished from his life, then the timing would make her— Samuel nearly dropped the bowl as the realization hit him. If his calculations were correct, and if Abigail was who he suspected, then she might well be his daughter. But that was impossible. Clara had died in the fire. Everyone had told him so. Unless Jeremiah Sullivan, the man who had just tried to kill Abigail, knew more about Clara's fate than he had ever revealed. The man who had been Samuel's business partner before the war. The man who had disappeared around the same time as Clara. Samuel's hands clenched involuntarily. Old wounds long scarred over suddenly felt fresh again. There were too many coincidences, too many connections to ignore. Looking back toward the bedroom where Abigail rested, Samuel made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth, whatever it might be. And if Jeremiah Sullivan had harmed Clara, had taken her from Samuel all those years ago, then there would be a reckoning. But first, Abigail needed to heal. Questions could wait until she was stronger. Samuel gathered himself and returned to the bedroom with the broth, his expression giving no hint of the storm brewing within. Night had fallen by the time Sheriff Wallace Monroe arrived at the Blackwood Ranch, his horse mud-splattered from the still sodden roads. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky brilliant with stars, but the ground remained treacherous. Samuel spotted the approaching rider from his porch, where he had been smoking his evening pipe. He recognized the distinctive silhouette of the lawman, the broad-brimmed hat, the straight-backed posture that spoke of military training. Setting aside his pipe, Samuel moved to meet the sheriff at the edge of his property. No sense in having Monroe come all the way to the house where Abigail might overhear their conversation. "Evening, Blackwood," Monroe called as he reined in his horse. "Quite a storm we had." Samuel nodded in greeting. "Sheriff, what brings you out this way at this hour?" Monroe dismounted his boots, squelching in the mud. He was a compact man, shorter than Samuel, but with the coiled tension of someone accustomed to violence. His badge gleamed in the moonlight, a symbol of authority that in Redemption Valley often extended only as far as was convenient for men like Sullivan. "Just checking on folks after the storm," Monroe replied, though his eyes scanned the property with too much interest for a casual visit. "Making sure no one needs assistance." "I appreciate the concern," Samuel said evenly, "but we managed well enough." Monroe's eyebrow raised at the word "we." "Didn't realize you had company, Blackwood. Always figured you for a solitary sort." Samuel kept his expression neutral. "My ranch hand is staying in the bunkhouse. Young fellow from Kansas, helping with the spring calving." It was a lie, but a plausible one. Samuel did occasionally hire temporary help during busy seasons, though he hadn't this year. "I see." Monroe nodded, but his gaze continued to roam. "Heard anything about a missing girl? Sullivan's stepdaughter ran off during the storm. He's mighty worried about her." Worried about losing his investment, more likely, Samuel thought bitterly. Aloud he said, "Can't say that I have. Haven't been to town since before the storm." Monroe studied him for a long moment. "That right, because Sullivan seems to think she might have headed this way." "And why would she do that?" Samuel asked, genuinely curious about what story Sullivan had concocted. "Who knows why women do what they do?" Monroe shrugged. "But if you do happen to see her pretty young thing, chestnut hair, blue dress, you'll let me know right away. Sullivan's offering a reward." "I'll keep an eye out," Samuel promised, knowing he would do no such thing. Monroe seemed about to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Blackwood. I noticed some clothes hanging on your line earlier. Looked like a woman's things." Samuel's mind raced, but his face betrayed nothing. "Mrs. Peterson from the next ranch over has been kind enough to do some mending for me. Must be what you saw." "Must be," Monroe agreed, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, I won't keep you any longer. Good night, Blackwood." "Sheriff," Samuel nodded in farewell. He watched as Monroe remounted and rode away, waiting until the lawman was well out of sight before returning to the house. Inside, he found Abigail standing in the bedroom doorway, leaning heavily against the frame, her face pale but determined. "You lied for me," she said simply. "I did," Samuel acknowledged. "Sullivan has the sheriff looking for you." Abigail's knuckles whitened as she gripped the doorframe tighter. "Did Monroe believe you?" "Not entirely," Samuel admitted. "But he has no cause to search the place. Not yet, anyway." Abigail took an unsteady step forward, and Samuel moved quickly to support her, guiding her to a chair by the fireplace. "You shouldn't be up," he chided gently. "Your body needs rest." "My body needs to get as far from Redemption Valley as possible," Abigail countered, though she didn't resist being seated. "Sullivan won't stop looking. Not after what happened." Samuel placed another log on the fire, watching the flames leap higher. "Tell me what happened, Abigail. The full story." She hesitated, studying him as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted with the truth. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Sullivan lost heavily at cards to Silas Reed. Gambling debts, not for the first time. But this time, he had nothing left to wager except me." Her hands twisted in her lap. "He tried to trade me to Reed to clear his debt. I refused. Things escalated. And Sullivan threw you into the river." Samuel finished, unable to keep the anger from his voice. Abigail nodded. "I'd never seen him so angry. It was like he wasn't even the same man anymore." She paused, a distant look in her eyes. "There were times when my mother was alive when he was almost kind. But after she died, something in him just broke." "Your mother," Samuel said carefully. What was her name? Clara, Abigail replied, and Samuel felt his heart constrict. Clara Reed. She married Sullivan when I was small, after my father died in the war. At least that's what Sullivan always told me. Samuel moved to the window, looking out at the night sky to hide his expression. And you have no memory of your birth father? None, Abigail admitted. Mother spoke of him sometimes, but never in detail. Just that he was a good man who would have loved me very much. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. When did your mother pass? 5 years ago, consumption took her. Abigail's voice softened with sorrow. She fought it for so long, but in the end. Samuel turned back to face her. I'm sorry for your loss. Truly. Abigail studied him with those penetrating blue eyes, Clara's eyes. Mr. Blackwood. Samuel, why did you really help me? The truth, please. Samuel hesitated. It was too soon to share his suspicions, his hopes. She was still weak from her ordeal, still processing the betrayal by her stepfather. To add another shock might overwhelm her. Because it was the right thing to do, he said finally. And because you reminded me of someone I once knew. Abigail seemed about to press further, but a fit of coughing overtook her, a reminder that her body was still recovering from both the river and the fever. You need rest, Samuel insisted, helping her back to the bedroom. We can talk more tomorrow. Abigail didn't protest her brief time out of bed, having exhausted her limited strength. As Samuel adjusted the blankets around her, she caught his hand. Thank you, she said simply. For everything. Samuel nodded, unable to trust his voice. He extinguished the lamp and left her to sleep, returning to the main room where the fire still burned low in the grate. From the trunk in the corner, he once again retrieved the wooden box with Clara's photograph. In the flickering firelight, he studied the beloved features, seeing now how they were echoed in Abigail's face. Samuel's mind turned to the past, to the last time he had seen Clara alive. It had been spring 1862. The war was a year old, and Samuel had received orders to report to a field hospital in Virginia. Clara had been 7 months pregnant with their first child. He had left her at their home in Kentucky, promising to return as soon as he could. 3 months later, he had received word that Confederate raiders had burned the homestead to the ground. Clara, according to neighbors, had perished in the flames. Samuel had nearly lost his mind with grief. Only his duty to the wounded soldiers in his care had kept him functioning. After the war, unable to face returning to Kentucky and its memories, he had drifted west, eventually settling in Redemption Valley, where he had built a new life as a rancher, leaving medicine behind, except for occasional assistance to neighbors. Never in all those years had he suspected that Clara might have survived, that their child might have lived. But now, sleeping in his bed was a young woman with Clara's hair. Clara's eyes, and approximately the right age to be the child Clara had been carrying when he last saw her. And somehow Jeremiah Sullivan was at the center of it all. Sullivan, who had been Samuel's business partner in a small freight company before the war. Sullivan, who had disappeared around the same time as the raid that supposedly killed Clara. Sullivan, who had apparently raised Abigail as his stepdaughter. Too many coincidences. Too many connections. Samuel returned the photograph to its box, his decision made. He would protect Abigail from Sullivan and Reed, whatever it took. And when she was stronger, he would uncover the truth about her past. Their past, even if it meant confronting the ghosts he had tried for so long to leave behind. Outside, an owl hooted its mournful cry, carrying through the night. In the bedroom, Abigail slept unaware of the man keeping vigil by the fire. The man who might be her father. The man who had already begun to love her as his own. The wheel of fate set in motion years ago had finally come full circle in Redemption Valley. Abigail woke to sunlight streaming through faded curtains. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. This wasn't her small room above the silver dollar. The bed was wider, the quilt unfamiliar, the air free from the perpetual scent of whiskey and tobacco that permeated the saloon. Then memory flooded back Sullivan, the river, the stranger who had pulled her from the water. Samuel Blackwood. She attempted to sit up, her muscles protesting after days of fever and inactivity. Her throat felt raw, her chest tight. But the crushing weakness of the previous days had begun to recede. The bedroom door stood partially open, and through it Abigail could hear the quiet sounds of movement, a chair scraping against the floor, the clink of a pot on the stove. Domestic sounds, ordinary and somehow comforting. With effort, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, noticing for the first time that she wore an oversized man's shirt that reached to her knees. Her blue dress was nowhere to be seen. The realization that Samuel must have changed her clothes brought a flush to her cheeks, though logic told her it had been a medical necessity, not an impropriety. Her bare feet touched the cool wooden floor, and she tested her weight cautiously. Dizziness washed over her, but she gripped the bedpost until it passed. Determined, she took one step, then another, making her way slowly to the bedroom door. The main room of the ranch house was modest but well kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a worn leather armchair positioned nearby. Bookshelves lined another wall filled with volumes that spoke of an educated mind, medical texts, history, literature. A round oak table with 4 chairs occupied the dining area, while the kitchen space held a cast-iron stove work table and simple cupboards. Samuel stood at the stove, his back to her, stirring something in a pot. He wore a faded blue shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with the lean muscle of a working man. His silver-streaked hair was tied back with a leather cord, emphasizing the strong lines of his profile. He must have sensed her presence, for he turned suddenly, surprise evident in his expression. "You shouldn't be up," he said, setting aside the wooden spoon and moving toward her. Abigail waved away his concern. "I've been abed long enough. Any longer, and I'll forget how to walk entirely." Despite her brave words, she was grateful when Samuel offered his arm, guiding her to the table. The short journey from bedroom to kitchen had depleted more of her strength than she cared to admit. "You're recovering well," Samuel observed, returning to the stove. "But pneumonia isn't something to take lightly. Your lungs need time to heal." Pneumonia. Abigail hadn't realized the extent of her illness. Samuel nodded, ladling what appeared to be oatmeal into a bowl. "River water in the lungs combined with exposure to the cold. You're fortunate to be alive, Miss Reed." "Abigail, please," she insisted, oddly bothered by the formality. "And yes, I'm beginning to understand just how fortunate." Samuel set the bowl before her along with a spoon and a mug of steaming tea. "Eat what you can," he instructed. "You need to regain your strength." The oatmeal was simple but flavored with cinnamon and honey, a small luxury that surprised her. Abigail hadn't expected such consideration from this solitary rancher, who had already done more than most would by saving her life. As she ate, Samuel busied himself around the kitchen, his movements efficient and practiced. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel secure for the first time in years. "The sheriff," she said, suddenly remembering the previous night's visitor. "Will he return?" Samuel paused in his work. "Likely. Monroe isn't easily dissuaded once he's on a trail. And when he does, we'll deal with that when it comes." Samuel's tone was matter-of-fact. "For now, focus on regaining your strength. Abigail studied him over the rim of her mug. "Why are you doing this, risking trouble with the law for a stranger?" Samuel turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Monroe isn't the law, not really. He's Sullivan's man, wearing a badge that gives him authority without responsibility. As for why I'm helping you," he hesitated. "Let's just say I have my reasons to dislike both Sullivan and the sheriff." Before Abigail could press further, Samuel changed the subject. "Your dress was beyond saving, too damaged from the river. I have some clothing that might serve until we can find something more suitable. A neighbor left some things behind when she moved on to Oregon last year." Abigail nodded, recognizing the deflection, but choosing not to push. "Thank you. I'm sorry to be such a burden." "You're not a burden," Samuel said simply. "You're a guest. There's a difference." The conviction in his voice silenced any further apologies. Abigail returned to her breakfast surprised by her appetite after days of illness. As she ate, she became aware of Samuel watching her with an intensity that was difficult to interpret. "Is something wrong?" she asked finally. Samuel seemed to catch himself, shaking his head slightly. "No, nothing. You just remind me of someone I once knew. The person you mentioned last night, the one I remind you of." "Yes?" Samuel turned away, busying himself with washing the cooking pot. "It was a long time ago." Something in his tone discouraged further questions, at least for now. Abigail finished her breakfast in silence, her mind turning to more practical concerns. "I can't stay here indefinitely," she said at last. "Sullivan won't stop looking for me, especially after what happened with Reed. I need to move on, get out of the territory altogether." Samuel dried his hands on a towel, considering her words. "And where would you go?" "San Francisco," Abigail replied without hesitation. "I've been saving for months. Not enough yet for the full journey, but perhaps enough to get started if I can retrieve my things from the saloon." "That's not possible right now," Samuel said firmly. "Going back to the saloon would be walking into Sullivan's hands. As for San Francisco," he sighed, "it's a worthy goal, but you're in no condition to travel, not yet." Abigail wanted to protest, but knew he was right. Even this brief time out of bed had left her exhausted, her lungs burning with the effort of simply sitting upright. "At least let me earn my keep while I'm here," she insisted. "I can cook, clean, mend whatever needs doing." Samuel's expression softened. "There'll be time for that when you're stronger. For now, the only work you need to concern yourself with is healing." The fatigue Abigail had been fighting suddenly overwhelmed her. She slumped slightly in her chair, and immediately Samuel was beside her, offering his support. "Back to bed," he said, his tone brooking no argument. This time Abigail didn't resist, as he helped her to her feet and guided her back to the bedroom. The short excursion had drained what little reserves she had built up during her restless sleep. As Samuel adjusted the pillows behind her, Abigail caught his wrist. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Samuel's expression was difficult to read. There was kindness there, certainly, but also something deeper, more complex. "Rest," he said simply, patting her hand before withdrawing. Left alone, Abigail sank back against the pillows, her body demanding sleep, even as her mind raced with questions. Who was this solitary rancher who had saved her life? What history did he share with Sullivan? And why did he look at her sometimes as if seeing a ghost? Sleep claimed her before she could puzzle out the answers, drawing her into dreams filled with rushing water. Her mother's face and the strange, comforting presence of Samuel Blackwood watching over her. Samuel sat on his porch as evening approached, smoking his pipe, and watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was a sight that never failed to move him, one of the reasons he had chosen this particular spot for his ranch, the unobstructed view of the mountains and the vast Montana sky. Inside, Abigail slept peacefully, her fever finally broken completely. Samuel had checked on her periodically throughout the day, relieved to see natural color returning to her cheeks, her breathing easier than it had been since he pulled her from the river. His pipe smoke curled lazily in the still air as his thoughts drifted to Clara, to the past, to the series of events that had led him to this moment. If Abigail was indeed his daughter, and he was increasingly convinced that she was, then fate had a strange sense of irony returning to him what he had thought lost forever in the most unexpected way. The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled him from his reverie. Samuel tamped out his pipe and rose, scanning the horizon for the rider. It was too early for Monroe to return, unless something had spurred a more urgent investigation. To his surprise, the approaching figure was not the sheriff, but an elderly woman on a dappled mare. Martha Hawkins, his nearest neighbor, and the closest thing to a friend Samuel had allowed himself in Redemption Valley. "Evening, Samuel," Martha called as she guided her horse into the yard. At 65, Martha was a widow who ran her small cattle operation with more efficiency than most men in the territory. Her gray hair was always neatly pinned beneath a practical hat, her clothing sturdy and functional. "Martha," Samuel nodded in greeting, moving to help her dismount. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Martha accepted his assistance with a grunt, her joints stiff from the ride. "Didn't see you at church yesterday," she said by way of explanation. "Thought I'd check that you hadn't finally been trampled by that ornery bull of yours." It was their usual exchange, Martha pretending her visits were merely neighborly duty, Samuel pretending he didn't look forward to them. In truth, Martha's company was one of the few social interactions he genuinely enjoyed. "The bull and I have reached an understanding," Samuel replied, leading the way to the porch. "He stays on his side of the fence. I stay on mine." Martha settled into the second chair, her sharp eyes taking in the porch, the yard, the extra horse in the corral that belonged to Abigail, or rather to Sullivan, though Samuel doubted the man would be getting it back. "Heard there was some excitement in town," Martha said casually. "Sullivan's stepdaughter went missing during the storm. Sheriff's been asking questions." Samuel should have known Martha would hear about it. Little happened in Redemption Valley. Without her knowledge, a network of church ladies and ranch wives kept her informed of even the most discreet happenings. "Monroe stopped by last night," Samuel acknowledged, deciding honesty was the best approach with Martha. "Looking for the girl." Martha's keen gaze settled on him. "And did he find what he was looking for?" "No." Samuel held her gaze steadily. "He did not." Martha nodded slowly, understanding, passing between them without words. "Sullivan claims she ran off after stealing from him. Says she took money from the saloon safe." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Is that what he's telling people?" "It's what he told the sheriff," Martha confirmed. "Though there are other whispers if one knows where to listen." "What kind of whispers?" Martha lowered her voice, though there was no one to overhear. "Silas Reed and his boys were at the saloon that night. Reed left in a foul mood, sporting a cut on his arm. One of his men was heard saying something about Sullivan's wildcat of a daughter before they rode out." Samuel absorbed this information, fitting it with what Abigail had told him. "Anything else?" Martha hesitated, then continued. "Sullivan was seen by the river that night during the worst of the storm, alone returning to town, soaked to the bone and muttering to himself. So there had been witnesses, or at least someone who had seen the aftermath. Samuel wondered if Monroe knew this part of the story. If he did, it painted a very different picture than Sullivan's tale of theft and flight. "I see," he said carefully. Martha studied him for a long moment. Samuel Blackwood, I've known you for 5 years. In all that time, you've never once involved yourself in town business or other folks' troubles. You keep to yourself, do your work, and ask nothing from anyone. Your point, Samuel raised an eyebrow. My point is that you're a good man who wouldn't harbor a thief. So if you've got Sullivan's stepdaughter hidden away in there, she nodded toward the house, I'm guessing there's more to the story than what's being told in town. Samuel weighed his options. Martha Hawkins was not a woman given to gossip for its own sake, nor did she have any love for Jeremiah Sullivan, whose business practices she found morally suspect. If anyone could be trusted with the truth, it was Martha. She nearly drowned in the river, Samuel said finally. I pulled her out during the storm. She's been fighting pneumonia for the past 3 days. Martha's expression softened. Poor child. Is she recovering? Slowly. She's young and strong, but it was a close thing. And Sullivan, Martha pressed, was he involved in her ending up in that river? Samuel's silence was answer enough. Martha shook her head, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. That man has the devil in him, always has from the day he settled here after the war. A thought struck Samuel. Martha, you've been in Redemption Valley longer than most. When exactly did Sullivan arrive? Let me think, Martha said, tilting her head in recollection. Must have been 65, just after Appomattox. He came with that pretty wife of his, Clara, I believe her name was. Sweet woman, much too good for the likes of him. And the little girl, of course. Abigail, Samuel supplied. Yes, that's right. Couldn't have been more than 10 or 11 at the time. Shy little thing always clinging to her mother's skirts. Martha's eyes narrowed as she studied Samuel's expression. Why do you ask? Samuel hesitated. I knew Sullivan before the war. We had a business arrangement in Kentucky. Did you now? Martha seemed surprised. Small world, I suppose. Though he's never mentioned knowing you all the times your name has come up in town. I imagine he wouldn't, Samuel said dryly. Our parting was not amicable. Martha clearly wanted to press for details, but restrained herself. Well, that explains some things, I suppose, but not why you'd risk crossing him and the sheriff to help the girl. Before Samuel could respond, a faint sound from inside the house caught his attention. Abigail calling his name. He rose immediately. Excuse me, Martha. I need to check on my patient. Martha waved him on. Go. I'll just sit here and enjoy what's left of the sunset. Samuel found Abigail attempting to get out of bed, her face pale with the effort. I heard voices, she explained as he steadied her. Is it the sheriff? No, just my neighbor, Martha Hawkins, Samuel assured her. She often checks in on me. Relief softened Abigail's features. I was afraid. You're safe, Samuel said firmly. Martha is a friend. She knows you're here and she can be trusted. Abigail nodded, allowing Samuel to help her back onto the bed. I'd like to meet her if that's all right. I've been alone with my thoughts too long. Samuel studied her for a moment. Though still weak, Abigail did seem stronger than earlier, her eyes clear and alert. Perhaps some company besides his own would do her good. Wait here, he said. I'll bring her in if she's willing. Martha, of course, was more than willing. Her curiosity about Sullivan's stepdaughter had been evident, and Samuel knew her well enough to recognize her concern was genuine. She's still very weak, Samuel warned as he led Martha inside. Try not to tire her. Martha gave him a look that suggested he was being overprotective. I raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands, Samuel. I think I know how to mind a sick girl. In the bedroom, Abigail had managed to sit up against the pillows, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger than her 22 years, in that moment vulnerable in a way that stirred Samuel's protective instincts. "Abigail, this is Martha Hawkins, my neighbor," Samuel introduced. "Martha Abigail Reed." Martha approached the bed, her weathered face softening with motherly concern. "My goodness, child, you've been through the wars, haven't you? But you're looking better than I expected given what Samuel told me." Abigail managed a small smile. "I'm told I'm stubborn. It seems that extends to staying alive when I shouldn't." Martha laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "Stubbornness is a virtue in these parts. It's what separates those who survive from those who don't." She settled into the chair beside the bed. "Now Samuel says you've had pneumonia from your dip in the river. How's the chest feeling? Any tightness when you breathe?" As the women spoke, Samuel retreated to the doorway, watching their interaction with a sense of relief. Martha had a way of putting people at ease, a directness that somehow comforted rather than offended. And Abigail clearly welcomed the female companionship after days with only Samuel for company. Their conversation flowed naturally, touching on Martha's ranch, her grandchildren in Oregon, the changing seasons, safe topics that allowed Abigail to relax. But eventually, as Samuel had known it would, the discussion turned to more serious matters. "Sullivan's been telling folks you stole from him and ran off," Martha said bluntly. "But that's not what happened, is it?" Abigail's expression hardened. "No, that's not what happened." "Want to tell me what did?" Martha's tone was gentle despite the directness of her question. Abigail glanced at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly from the doorway. Taking a deep breath, she recounted the events of that night, Sullivan's gambling losses, his attempt to settle the debt by giving her to Reed, her escape, and finally Sullivan throwing her into the flooded river. Martha listened without interruption, her face growing more grave with each detail. When Abigail finished, the older woman reached out and patted her hand. "You poor child. To think your own stepfather would do such a thing." Martha shook her head in disgust. "Though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. Sullivan has always had a darkness in him, especially since your mother passed." "You knew my mother?" Abigail asked eagerly. "Not well," Martha admitted. "She didn't socialize much. Sullivan kept her rather isolated. But we spoke at church sometimes. She was a gentle soul, your mother. Always spoke of you with such pride." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. "I miss her every day." "Of course you do," Martha said softly. "A mother's love isn't easily replaced." From the doorway, Samuel watched the exchange with a tightness in his chest. Clara, gentle, loving Clara, had raised their daughter well, despite whatever circumstances had led her to stay with Sullivan. The evidence was before him in Abigail's quiet dignity, her resilience, her inherent goodness. "Did my mother ever speak of her life before Redemption Valley?" Abigail asked her question, drawing Samuel's full attention. Of my father," Martha considered this. "Not to me, dear, though there was always a sadness about her when the past was mentioned. I got the impression she had left something or someone behind that she cherished." Abigail nodded, disappointment evident in her expression. "Sullivan always told me my father died in the war, but Mother would never confirm it. She would just say he was a good man who would have loved me very much." Samuel felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. Those words, "a good man who would have loved me very much," they were almost exactly what he had thought earlier about how he would have felt toward his child with Clara. It was another piece fitting into the puzzle, another confirmation of what he already suspected. Martha was watching him now, her sharp eyes noting his reaction. There was a question in her gaze, one that Samuel wasn't ready to answer, not until he was certain, not until he had spoken with Abigail. Well, Martha said, breaking the moment, what matters now is keeping you safe until you're well enough to decide what comes next. She turned to Samuel. I assume you have a plan beyond hiding her in your spare bedroom. Samuel stepped fully into the room. For now, Abigail stays here out of sight. Once she's stronger, we can consider options. Perhaps passage to Oregon, where your daughter's family could take her in until she's established. That's months away, Abigail protested. I can't impose on you for so long. It's no imposition, Samuel assured her. This ranch is remote enough that Sullivan is unlikely to search here thoroughly, especially if Martha helps spread word that you were seen heading north toward Helena. Martha nodded, catching on immediately. I can do that. Mention to Widow Jenkins that her cousin thought he saw a young woman matching Abigail's description on the Helena Road. Jenkins gossips more than a magpie. It'll be all over town by sundown tomorrow. Abigail looked between them, torn between gratitude and concern. You would both risk so much for me. Why? Martha answered first. Because it's the right thing to do, child. And because Sullivan has had his way in this valley for too long, it's about time someone stood against him. Samuel merely nodded his agreement, though his reasons went far deeper than Martha's. If Abigail was indeed his daughter, then helping her wasn't charity, or even basic human decency. It was his duty, his privilege, his second chance at being the father he had never had the opportunity to be. Seeing that Abigail was tiring, Martha rose to leave. I should head back before dark, but I'll return tomorrow with some proper clothes for you, young lady. Samuel's shirts may be practical, but they're hardly fashionable. Abigail smiled gratefully. Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins. Martha, please. Mrs. Hawkins makes me feel like my mother-in-law. God rest her sour soul. She patted Abigail's hand once more. Rest now. Things have a way of working out, even when they seem darkest. Samuel escorted Martha outside where the last rays of sunset were fading into twilight. As they reached her horse, Martha turned to him with a knowing look. There's something you're not telling me, Samuel Blackwood. Something about that girl and why you're really helping her. Samuel sighed. Martha had always been too perceptive for comfort. It's complicated, Martha. Life usually is. She studied him for a moment. She has a look about her, reminds me of someone, though I can't quite place who. And the way you watch her like you're seeing a ghost. Martha trailed off. Then her eyes widened in sudden understanding. The photograph. The one on your mantel when I first visited years ago. The woman in it had that same chestnut hair. Those same blue eyes. Samuel remained silent, neither confirming nor denying her suspicion. Martha shook her head slowly. Clara, Sullivan's wife. That's who Abigail reminds me of. And that photograph that was Clara too, wasn't it before Sullivan? When she was with you. Martha, Samuel began, but she held up a hand to stop him. No need to explain, not to me. I can piece it together well enough. Her expression softened. Does Abigail know that you might be her father? No, Samuel admitted. And I'm not certain myself, not yet. The timing fits, the resemblance is there, but without speaking to Clara. Which isn't possible, Martha finished gently. Well, there are other ways to find the truth, and perhaps it's time Abigail learned it, whatever it may be. Samuel helped her mount her horse. In time, when she's stronger. Martha gathered the reins. Don't wait too long, Samuel. Truth has a way of revealing itself often when we least expect it. With a final nod, she turned her horse and rode away, leaving Samuel alone with his thoughts, as darkness settled over the land. The next week passed in a rhythm of slow recovery for Abigail. Each day brought increased strength, decreased pain in her lungs, and a growing comfort in Samuel's quiet presence. True to her word, Martha had returned with clothing, simple dresses, a shawl, even a pair of worn but serviceable boots that fit well enough. By the 8th day after her rescue, Abigail was able to move around the house freely, though Samuel still insisted she rest frequently and avoid exertion. She had begun to make herself useful in small ways, preparing simple meals, mending Samuel's shirts, reading aloud from his books in the evenings as they sat by the fire. It was during one such evening that Abigail finally broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Samuel," she began, setting aside the volume of Emerson she had been reading, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Samuel looked up from the harness he was repairing. "What's that? You knew Sullivan before the war. You mentioned a business arrangement that ended badly." Abigail hesitated, then pressed on. "What happened between you two?" Samuel's hands stilled on the leather. He had known this question would come eventually, had been preparing for it, yet still found himself reluctant to answer. Not because he wished to hide the truth from Abigail, but because the truth would inevitably lead to more questions, to revelations he wasn't sure she was ready to hear. But looking at her now, her face illuminated by the firelight, her expression earnest and determined, Samuel realized she deserved honesty. If she was indeed his daughter, then her past was as much hers as it was his. Setting aside the harness, Samuel leaned back in his chair. "Sullivan and I were partners in a freight company in Kentucky before the war. Small operation, just 3 wagons, and a modest contract with merchants in Lexington. But it was profitable, growing steadily." Abigail listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. "And what went wrong?" "The war was coming. Everyone could feel it even before Fort Sumter. Sullivan wanted to expand southward, secure contracts with Confederate sympathizers. I disagreed, partly because I supported the Union, partly because it seemed financially risky." Samuel's gaze drifted to the fire. "The disagreement turned heated. Sullivan accused me of betraying our partnership, of being blinded by politics." "Was that all?" Abigail sensed there was more to the story. Samuel shook his head. "No, the business dispute was just the beginning. What truly divided us was—" He faltered, unsure how to continue without revealing too much too soon. "Was what?" Abigail prompted gently. Samuel met her gaze directly. "My wife, Clara." Abigail stiffened, her eyes widening. "Clara? But that was my mother's name." "Yes." Samuel's voice was soft, heavy with the weight of memory. "Clara Edwards. We married in 1854. She was the daughter of a local doctor, educated, gentle-hearted, but strong-willed when it mattered." Abigail's hands trembled slightly as she processed this information. This can't be coincidence." "No," Samuel agreed. "I don't believe it is." "My mother," Abigail said slowly. "Her maiden name was Edwards. She told me once when I asked about her family, said they were from Kentucky originally." The confirmation sent a jolt through Samuel, though he had already suspected as much. "Clara and I had been married for nearly 8 years when the war broke out. I was called to serve as a surgeon with the Union Army. She was with child when I left." Abigail's breath caught audibly. "With child? You mean—" "I received word 3 months into my service that Confederate raiders had burned our home. Neighbors reported that Clara had perished in the fire." Samuel's voice thickened with emotion long suppressed. "I believed her dead, believed our unborn child dead for 15 years. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Abigail sat perfectly still, her face a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning comprehension. "Sullivan told me my father died in the war," she whispered finally. "A Union soldier. He said my mother had been a widow when he married her." Samuel nodded grimly. "A convenient story. The truth, I suspect, is that Sullivan took advantage of the chaos of war to take what wasn't his, my business, my home, and my wife." "But why would my mother go with him? Stay with him?" Abigail's voice held a note of desperate confusion. "If she was your wife, if she loved you as you seem to have loved her—" "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "That's one of many questions only Clara could answer. And now—" He left the sentence unfinished, the shared grief of Clara's death hanging between them. Abigail rose suddenly, moving to the window where moonlight silvered the landscape. Her reflection in the glass showed a face struggling to reconcile a lifetime of beliefs with these new revelations. "You think I'm your daughter," she said finally, her back still to Samuel. It wasn't a question. "I believe it's possible," Samuel replied carefully. "The timing would be right. You were born in early 1863, I presume." "January 15th, Abigail confirmed, still facing the window. "Clara was due in February. You came a bit early, perhaps, but that's not unusual, especially in times of stress." Samuel remained in his chair, giving her the space she clearly needed. "There's also the resemblance. You have Clara's hair, her eyes, even some of her mannerisms." Abigail turned slowly to face him. "If what you're saying is true, then my entire life has been built on lies. Sullivan isn't my stepfather. He's nothing to me. And you," her voice faltered, "you would be my father." The word father hung in the air between them, loaded with implication, with possibility, with the weight of 15 years of absence. "Yes," Samuel said simply, "I would be your father." Abigail sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. It's too much to take in all at once." "I understand," Samuel assured her. "I've had days to consider it, to adjust to the possibility, and still find myself stunned by the idea. I don't expect you to accept it immediately, or at all, if you find you cannot." "It's not that I can't accept it," Abigail said slowly. "It's that it changes everything I thought I knew about myself, about my mother, about the past." Samuel nodded. "The past has a way of reaching into the present, whether we invite it or not." A thought seemed to strike Abigail. "Sullivan must know. If what you say is true, if he took my mother during the war, then he knows you're my father. He's always known." "I believe so," Samuel agreed, his jaw tightening, "which might explain his reaction when you mentioned your mother that night at the river. If he thought you were beginning to question the story he'd constructed." "He would see it as a threat," Abigail finished. "Something that could unravel the life he'd built on lies." They sat in silence for a moment, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Finally, Abigail spoke again, her voice steadier. "I need time to process this, to adjust to the idea that you might be my father." "Of course," Samuel said gently. "Take all the time you need. Nothing has to change between us, unless you wish it to." Abigail studied him for a long moment. "If you are my father, and I'm not saying I'm convinced yet, but if you are, then I would like to know more about you, about the man my mother might have loved, about the life I might have had." Samuel felt a surge of hope at her words. "I would like that too. Very much." Abigail nodded, then rose again, fatigue evident in her movements. "I think I need to rest now. It's been an overwhelming evening." "Of course," Samuel stood as well. Sleep well, Abigail. She paused at the bedroom door, looking back at him with an expression that reminded him so strongly of Clara that it made his heart ache. Good night, Samuel. Not father, not yet, perhaps never. But there was a softening in the way she said his name, an acknowledgement of the bond that might exist between them, waiting to be recognized. After she had gone, Samuel remained by the fire, lost in memories of Clara, of the life they had shared, of the future they had planned together. The past could not be changed, but perhaps, in Abigail, there was a chance to reclaim something of what had been lost. Outside, an owl called into the night, its lonely cry echoing across the valley. Samuel added another log to the fire and settled deeper into his chair, prepared for a long night of reflection. As the flames danced before him, shadows of the past and present merging in their flickering light. The sound of hoofbeats penetrated Abigail's troubled dreams, pulling her back to consciousness with a jolt of fear. Sunlight streamed through the window, indicating late morning, later than she had slept in days. The conversation with Samuel the previous night had left her emotionally drained, and her body had demanded the rest. Her mind had been too agitated to grant easily. Now, fully awake, she listened intently. The hoofbeats had stopped, replaced by the murmur of voices from outside, Samuel's deep, measured tones, and another unfamiliar voice. Quickly, Abigail, dressed in one of the simple dresses Martha had provided, ran a brush through her hair and moved cautiously to the window. From her vantage point, she could see part of the yard where Samuel stood, speaking with a man she didn't recognize. Not the sheriff, thankfully, but a stranger on a lathered horse that had clearly been ridden hard. The man handed Samuel a folded paper, spoke a few more words that Abigail couldn't make out, then remounted and rode away at a more measured pace. Samuel remained in the yard, reading whatever message he had received, his expression growing increasingly grave. Concerned, Abigail made her way to the main room just as Samuel entered from outside, the paper still in his hand. "What is it?" she asked, noting the troubled look on his face. "Bad news." Samuel seemed momentarily startled to find her up and dressed. "A message from Martha," he said, holding up the paper, "delivered by her ranch hand. It seems Sullivan has intensified his search for you." Abigail's stomach tightened with apprehension. "How?" "He's offering a substantial reward, now $500 for information leading to your return, and he's hired Reed and his men to help in the search." The news hit Abigail like a physical blow. $500 was a fortune in these parts, enough to tempt even honest folk. And Reed would be motivated by more than money after the way she had humiliated him at the saloon. "They'll find me," she whispered, sinking into a chair. "Someone will talk or notice something suspicious, or—" "They won't find you," Samuel interrupted firmly. "Not here. But Martha's right. We need to be more cautious. No more trips outside, even just to the porch. And we should be prepared to move you quickly, if necessary." Abigail nodded, trying to steady her nerves. "Where would I go if they started searching ranches?" Samuel considered this. "There's an old line shack up in the foothills about 3 miles from here. Used it when I first settled and was building the main house. It's basic but serviceable. No one would think to look there." The practicality of his planning helped calm Abigail's rising panic. "All right. What else does Martha say?" Samuel glanced back at the note. "Reed and one of his men were in town yesterday, asking questions at the general store, the blacksmith's. They're being methodical, working outward from town in a grid pattern." "Which means they'll reach this area eventually," Abigail concluded. "Yes, but not for several days at least. By then, we'll have a better plan." Samuel folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. "In the meantime, we continue as we have been. You focus on regaining your strength. I'll handle the rest." His confidence was reassuring, but Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful interlude was coming to an end. Sullivan was not a man to give up easily, especially when his pride was at stake. "Samuel," she said hesitantly, "about last night, about what you told me." "We don't need to discuss it now," Samuel said quickly. "You have enough to worry about without adding that burden." "No, I want to." Abigail straightened in her chair. "If you truly are my father, and I'm beginning to believe you might be, then I need to understand why my mother stayed with Sullivan all those years, why she never told me the truth." Samuel sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. "I've been asking myself the same questions. Clara was not a woman easily coerced or frightened. For her to remain with Sullivan, to maintain his lie—" He shook his head. "There must have been a compelling reason." "Could she have loved him?" Abigail suggested, though the idea pained her. "Perhaps she chose him over you, and the story about your death was to spare my feelings." "Possible," Samuel acknowledged, though his expression suggested he found it unlikely. "But that doesn't explain why Sullivan would attempt to harm you now when you began asking questions about your mother. If their relationship had been legitimate, why react so violently?" Abigail had no answer for that. The pieces still didn't fit together completely, leaving a puzzle with crucial sections missing. "I wish we could ask her," she said softly. "As do I." Samuel's voice held equal measures of sorrow and regret. "But perhaps there are other sources of information. Martha mentioned that your mother didn't socialize much, but she did attend church. There might be others in town who knew her, who noticed things Sullivan wouldn't have wanted noticed." Abigail considered this. Mrs. Peterson, perhaps. She was kind to Mother when she was ill, and Reverend Hayes, Mother, spoke with him often. "Good," Samuel nodded. "When it's safe, we can make discreet inquiries. For now, though, we focus on keeping you safe from Sullivan and Reed." The mention of Reed brought Abigail's thoughts back to their immediate danger. "Samuel, if Reed finds me here, he won't just take me back to Sullivan. He'll want revenge for what happened at the saloon." "Reed won't touch you," Samuel said with such quiet ferocity that Abigail was momentarily taken aback. "I won't allow it." The protective instinct in his voice, paternal fierce, stirred something in Abigail, a longing she had almost forgotten how to feel. How different might her life have been with this man as her father, rather than the cold calculation of Sullivan. "Thank you," she said, simply unable to fully express the gratitude she felt for his protection, his care, his willingness to believe in a connection neither of them could fully prove. Samuel seemed about to respond when the distant sound of hoofbeats once again reached them, multiple horses this time approaching from the direction of town. "Stay inside," Samuel ordered, moving swiftly to the window. "Away from the windows where you can't be seen." Abigail retreated to the kitchen area as Samuel peered cautiously through the curtains. His back stiffened, and she knew before he spoke that their precautions had come too late. "Sheriff Monroe," Samuel said grimly, "and he's not alone. Sullivan's with him." Fear clutched at Abigail's heart. How did they know to look here?" "I don't know," Samuel replied, his mind clearly racing. "But there's no time to get you to the line shack. You'll have to hide here." He moved quickly to a corner of the main room, pulling aside a large braided rug to reveal a trap door in the floorboards. "Root cellar," he explained, lifting the door. "It's not comfortable, but it's the only place they won't think to search thoroughly. Hurry." Abigail didn't hesitate, gathering her skirts and descending the narrow ladder into the darkness below. The cellar was small, earthy-smelling, lined with shelves of preserved foods and root vegetables. There was just enough room for her to crouch on the dirt floor. "Stay absolutely silent," Samuel instructed, handing down a small lantern. "No matter what you hear, I'll get rid of them as quickly as I can." Abigail knotted her throat too tight with fear to speak. Samuel gave her one last reassuring look, then closed the trap door and replaced the rug. Darkness enveloped her, broken only by the thin lines of light filtering through the floorboards above, and the small lantern which she left unlit to avoid any telltale glow. From her hiding place, Abigail could hear the muffled sound of horses entering the yard, the creak of saddle leather as riders dismounted, the heavy tread of boots on the porch. Then came the sharp rap of knuckles on the door, followed by Sheriff Monroe's voice, too indistinct to make out the words, but clear in its authoritative tone. Samuel's deeper voice responded, and the door opened. Abigail pressed herself against the earthy wall of the cellar, willing her breathing to remain quiet, her presence undetected. Above, heavy footsteps moved across the floorboards, multiple sets pacing the small house. "Warrant to search the premises," Monroe was saying, his voice now clear enough to understand. "Sullivan here has reason to believe his stepdaughter might be hiding on your property." "And what reason would that be?" Samuel's voice was calm, revealing nothing. "You two have history," came another voice, Sullivan's, the sound of it sending a chill through Abigail, despite the warmth of the cellar. "Bad blood from before the war. Makes sense you'd help her just to spite me." "Our history, as you put it, is ancient history," Samuel replied evenly. "I haven't seen or spoken to you in 15 years, Sullivan. Why would I suddenly involve myself in your family matters? Because you're a sanctimonious bastard who never could mind his own business," Sullivan retorted. "Always had to play the hero, didn't you, Blackwood, even when it wasn't your place?" The personal animosity in Sullivan's voice confirmed what Samuel had told her. These men had a shared past, a conflict that had never been resolved. "Search if you must, Sheriff," Samuel said, ignoring Sullivan's provocations. "But you won't find the girl here. I haven't seen her." "We'll just have a look around if you don't mind," Monroe replied, his tone suggesting it wasn't a request. Footsteps moved throughout the house, opening doors, checking the bedroom, the pantry, even lifting the lid of the large trunk in the corner, judging by the distinctive creak of its hinges. Abigail held her breath as someone walked directly over the trapdoor, the floorboards groaning under their weight. "What's in the barn?" Monroe's voice asked. "Just my horse's tack feed," Samuel replied. "Feel free to look." The footsteps receded, the front door opened and closed, and for a moment the house fell silent. Abigail began to hope they had all gone to search the outbuildings, but then a single set of footsteps returned, moving slowly, deliberately across the main room. "I know she's here, Blackwood," Sullivan's voice said, quiet but intense. "I can feel it, and when I find her, you'll both regret crossing me." "You always did have an inflated sense of your own importance, Jeremiah," Samuel replied, his voice closer now, as if he had followed Sullivan back inside. "Some things never change." "And you always were blind to what was right in front of you," Sullivan shot back. "Too wrapped up in your high-minded principles to see reality." "Reality?" Samuel's voice held a dangerous edge now. "Like the reality that you tried to drown your stepdaughter in the river rather than face the consequences of your gambling debts." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Sullivan laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "So that's it. You did fish her out. I should have known, always had a weakness for strays, didn't you?" "She's not here now," Samuel said firmly. "And even if she were, I wouldn't let you near her." "You have no say in the matter," Sullivan growled. "She's my responsibility, not yours." "Is she?" Samuel's voice was quiet, but carried clearly to Abigail's hiding place. "Are you certain of that, Jeremiah?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Abigail found herself holding her breath, waiting for Sullivan's response. When it came, his voice had changed, become almost wary. "What are you suggesting, Blackwood?" "I think you know exactly what I'm suggesting," Samuel replied. "About Abigail, about Clara, about what really happened in '62. Sullivan's next words chilled Abigail to the bone. "Be careful, Blackwood. Some secrets are better left buried, for everyone's sake." "The truth has a way of surfacing," Samuel countered. "One way or another." "Sullivan," Monroe's voice called from outside. "Nothing in the barn or the corral, just horses and cattle." "Keep looking," Sullivan called back, then lowered his voice again. "This isn't over, Blackwood. Not by a long shot." "On that we agree," Samuel replied. Footsteps moved toward the door, paused, then Sullivan spoke once more. "If you see Abigail, tell her I'm not angry anymore. Tell her she can come home and all will be forgiven. I was not myself that night. I'll be sure to pass that along should I see her." Samuel said, his tone making it clear he believed none of Sullivan's conciliatory words. The door opened and closed, and the house fell silent again. Abigail remained frozen in her hiding place, heart pounding, mind racing with the implications of what she had just heard. Sullivan knew, or at least suspected, that Samuel might be her father, and whatever had happened between them in the past, it was clearly more complex than a simple business disagreement. Several minutes passed before the trapdoor finally opened, revealing Samuel's concerned face. "They're gone," he said, extending a hand to help her up. "Riding back toward town." Abigail emerged from the cellar on shaky legs, gratefully accepting Samuel's support. "He knows," she said. "Sullivan knows you might be my father." "Yes," Samuel agreed grimly. "It seems he does, which makes our situation even more precarious." "What did he mean about secrets being better left buried?" Abigail asked, settling into a chair as her legs threatened to give way. "What happened in '62 that he's so afraid of?" Samuel shook his head. "I'm not certain, but I intend to find out." He moved to the window, watching the distant figures of Monroe and Sullivan disappearing down the road. "One thing is clear, though, you're not safe here anymore. They may not have found you today, but Sullivan won't give up so easily. He'll be back with more men, perhaps with a proper search warrant." "Where can I go?" Abigail asked. "If not here, if not back to town, then where?" Samuel turned to face her, his expression resolute. "There's only one place I can think of where Sullivan wouldn't dare follow. We need to go to Martha Hawkins." "Martha? But why would Sullivan not follow us there?" "Because Martha knows everyone in the territory, including the circuit judge who outranks Monroe. And because her late husband was a founding member of the Montana Vigilance Committee. She has connections that even Sullivan respects, or at least fears." Abigail nodded slowly, understanding the logic. "When do we leave?" "Tonight," Samuel decided. "After dark. We'll take the back trails, it's longer but safer. We should reach Martha's by morning." As Samuel began making preparations, gathering supplies, planning their route, Abigail remained by the window watching the road where Sullivan and the sheriff had disappeared. Her world had been upended first by Sullivan's betrayal, then by Samuel's revelations, and now by the knowledge that the past was rushing toward her like a river in flood, carrying secrets that had been submerged for far too long. Whatever the truth might be about her parentage, about her mother's choices, about the conflict between the two men who had shaped her life in such different ways, Abigail knew that soon she would have to face it. And when she did, nothing would ever be the same again. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. In the growing darkness, Abigail and Samuel prepared for their journey, each lost in their own thoughts, united by a common purpose and the fragile, tentative bond of what might be the most profound connection of all, that of father and daughter separated by fate, reunited by chance, and now fighting together against a shared enemy. As night fell, they slipped away from the ranch, two shadows merging with the darkness, leaving behind the temporary sanctuary that had sheltered them and moving toward an uncertain future, where long-buried secrets waited to be unearthed, regardless of the cost. Night had fully descended by the time Abigail and Samuel left the ranch. A sliver of moon provided just enough light to navigate the narrow trail that wound through the pines away from the main road and into the foothills that separated Samuel's property from Martha Hawkins's ranch. Samuel led the way on his sturdy gelding, while Abigail followed on a gentle mare he kept for light work. Despite her improved health, the exertion of riding after weeks of illness took its toll. Her lungs burned with each breath of the cool night air, and her muscles protested the unfamiliar activity. But she pressed on without complaint, understanding the necessity of their midnight flight. They traveled in silence for the most part, both to avoid detection and because each was lost in their own thoughts. Occasionally, Samuel would glance back to check on her, his expression softening with concern when he noted her fatigue. "We can rest if you need to," he offered during one such moment, reining in his horse. Abigail shook her head. "I'm fine. Better to keep moving." Samuel studied her for a moment longer, then nodded in approval. "You have your mother's determination," he said quietly, before turning back to the trail. The simple observation delivered without fanfare sent a surprising warmth through Abigail's chest. Throughout her life, comparisons to her mother had been rare. Sullivan had seemed almost reluctant to acknowledge the resemblance, as if it pained him somehow. To hear Samuel speak of Clara with such easy familiarity, recognizing traits that connected mother and daughter, felt like reclaiming a piece of herself that had long been denied. The trail gradually steepened as they entered the foothills, requiring more concentration from both riders and horses. Pine trees gave way to rocky outcroppings that gleamed silver in the moonlight. An owl called from somewhere overhead, its mournful cry echoing through the darkness. "Not much farther now," Samuel assured her as they crested a rise. "Martha's ranch lies just beyond that next ridge. We should make it before dawn." Abigail nodded, too breathless to respond. The higher elevation was taxing her already weakened lungs, but she was determined not to slow their progress. If Sullivan had indeed suspected that she was hiding at Samuel's ranch, it wouldn't take him long to organize a more thorough search, perhaps, as soon as morning. They paused at the top of the ridge, looking down into the adjacent valley where Martha's ranch sprawled, a collection of buildings just visible in the distance. No lights burned at this hour, but the outline of the main house and barn stood out against the lighter ground. "We'll approach from the east," Samuel decided, pointing to a stand of trees that would provide cover almost to the edge of Martha's property. Less visible from the road that way. As they began their descent, a distant sound froze them both, hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast along the main road that skirted the base of the foothills. "Get down!" Samuel ordered, dismounting and leading his horse behind a large boulder. Abigail followed suit, her heart pounding as they concealed themselves from the riders below. From their vantage point, they could see a group of horsemen, 5 or 6. It was hard to tell in the darkness, galloping toward Martha's ranch. Moonlight glinted off something metallic, a badge perhaps, or the barrel of a rifle. "Sheriff Monroe," Samuel muttered, his voice tight with anger. "And those others, Reed's men by the look of them." "How did they know?" Abigail whispered, fear constricting her throat. "How could they possibly know we were heading to Martha's?" Samuel shook his head, his expression grim. Someone must have seen us leave or guessed our destination. Sullivan knows I'm friends with Martha. It wouldn't be a difficult conclusion to reach. They watched as the riders approached Martha's ranch, slowing as they neared the main house. Even from this distance, they could see the flare of lanterns being lit, the dark shapes of men surrounding the building. "They'll wake her search the place," Samuel said, his mind clearly racing. "When they don't find us, they might post guards wait for us to arrive." "What do we do now?" Abigail asked, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the terror threatening to overwhelm her. Samuel was silent for a long moment, considering their limited options. Finally he said, "We can't go to Martha's now, and we can't return to my ranch that'll be watched too. The line shack you mentioned. Possibly, but it's back toward my property. Too risky with Monroe and his men between us and there." Samuel rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "No, we need somewhere they wouldn't think to look somewhere unexpected." Abigail thought furiously, then an idea struck her. "What about Redemption Valley itself? The town?" Samuel looked at her in surprise. "The town that would be walking straight into Sullivan's territory." "Exactly," Abigail said, the plan forming as she spoke. "It's the last place they'd expect us to go. They're searching ranches, outlying areas. Meanwhile, we could be hiding right under their noses." "It's risky," Samuel acknowledged, but she could see he was considering it. "Where in town could we possibly stay without being seen?" "The old church," Abigail suggested. "The original one, not the new building they constructed 3 years ago. It's been abandoned since the roof partially collapsed, but the back rooms where the minister lived are still intact. No one goes there anymore." Samuel's eyebrows rose, impressed by her reasoning. "How do you know about this place?" A ghost of a smile touched Abigail's lips. "Mother used to take me there to pray sometimes when Sullivan was difficult. She said she preferred the peace of the old building to the pretensions of the new one." Samuel nodded slowly, his expression softening at this glimpse of Clara's quiet rebellion. "It could work," he conceded. "We'd need supplies, though. Food, water, blankets. There's a well behind the building that still functions. As for food and blankets—" Abigail hesitated, then continued, "I know someone who might help. Walter, the piano player at the Silver Dollar. He was kind to my mother during her illness and to me afterward. His loyalty is to me, not Sullivan." Samuel considered this for a moment, weighing the risks against their limited alternatives. "All right," he decided finally. "We'll try your plan, but we'll need to be extremely careful entering town. One sighting, one slip, and we're finished." They remained hidden until Monroe and his men had completed their search of Martha's ranch and posted guards, 2 men stationed at the front and rear of the property. Then, leading their horses to minimize noise, Samuel and Abigail skirted the ridge, giving the ranch a wide berth as they made their way toward a different trail that would take them to Redemption Valley. The night had grown colder, a reminder that winter was not far off. Abigail shivered in her light dress, wishing she had thought to bring a heavier shawl. Noticing her discomfort, Samuel removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders without comment, ignoring her protests that he would be cold. "I'm accustomed to the elements," he said simply. "You're still recovering." It was a small gesture, but one that touched Abigail deeply. Sullivan would never have sacrificed his own comfort for hers. Another stark contrast between the man who had raised her and the man who might truly be her father. By the time they reached the outskirts of Redemption Valley, the eastern sky had begun to lighten, the stars fading as dawn approached. They left their horses concealed in a dense copse of trees about a half-mile from town, covering the remaining distance on foot, to avoid the distinctive sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed dirt of the main street. The town was still sleeping, shutters closed against the night, only the occasional lamp burning in a window. They kept to the shadows, moving swiftly and silently past the familiar buildings, the general store, the blacksmith shop, the doctor's office, until they reached the far end of town, where the old church stood partially hidden behind overgrown bushes and a stand of cottonwood trees. The building was much as Abigail had described, a modest wooden structure with a partially collapsed roof over the main sanctuary, but with the attached living quarters at the rear still relatively intact. They approached cautiously alert for any sign that the place might be watched or occupied, but found it deserted as expected. The door to the minister's quarters was secured with a simple latch easily opened. Inside, dust covered every surface and cobwebs draped the corners, but the space was dry and, most importantly, hidden from casual observation. A small bedroom, a sitting area with a stone fireplace, and a rudimentary kitchen comprised the living space, humble but sufficient for their needs. "It's not much," Abigail said apologetically as they entered, "but no one will think to look for us here." Samuel surveyed the space with a practical eye. "It will serve. We can clear away some of this dust, perhaps risk a small fire once night falls if the temperature drops further. The chimney seems intact, and the smoke would blend with that from other buildings." As he spoke, he was already moving about the space, checking the stability of the structure, examining the fireplace for obstructions, ensuring there were no unwelcome animal residents. His methodical approach reminded Abigail that he had been a surgeon accustomed to assessing situations quickly and acting decisively. "I should try to find Walter," Abigail said, removing Samuel's coat and folding it carefully over a chair. "He'll be heading to the saloon soon to prepare for the day. I can catch him before anyone else is about." Samuel frowned. "It's too dangerous. Sullivan or his men could be anywhere." "It's early yet," Abigail countered. "Sullivan never rises before 9, and the saloon won't open until noon. This is our best chance to get supplies without being seen." Samuel's frown deepened, but he recognized the logic of her argument. "Very well, but be extremely careful. Cover your hair. It's too distinctive. And if you see anyone at all, turn back immediately." Abigail nodded, grateful for his concern, but determined to contribute to their survival. Using a dusty curtain from one of the windows, she fashioned a makeshift shawl to cover her head and shoulders, effectively concealing her chestnut hair and much of her face. "I'll return as quickly as I can," she promised, slipping out the door and into the gray light of early morning. The town was beginning to stir as she made her way cautiously toward the Silver Dollar Keeping, to back alleys and shadowed passages between buildings. A few shopkeepers were sweeping their storefronts. A wagon, loaded with supplies, rumbled down the main street, but no one paid particular attention to the shawl-covered woman hurrying along with her head down. The saloon was still locked when she reached it, but a light burned in the back window, where she knew Walter often practiced before opening hours. Rather than risk the front entrance, Abigail made her way to the rear of the building, to the small door that led directly to the piano player's modest room. She knocked softly 3 times, then twice more, an old signal they had established during her mother's illness, when Abigail would sometimes come seeking Walter's help in the pre-dawn hours. The door opened cautiously, revealing Walter's weathered face, lined with age and hardship, but still kind. His white hair was tousled, as if he had just risen, and he squinted in the dim light, trying to identify his visitor. "It's me, Walter," Abigail whispered, lowering the shawl slightly. "Abigail." Walter's rheumy eyes widened in shock, then relief. "Good Lord, child," he breathed, pulling her quickly inside and shutting the door. "The whole town's been searching for you. Sullivan's offering a small fortune for your return." "I know," Abigail said grimly. "That's why I need your help. And quickly, she explained her situation the night of the storm, Sullivan's attempt to sell her to Reed, her rescue by Samuel, and their current predicament. She omitted the possibility that Samuel might be her father, not out of distrust for Walter, but because there was no time for lengthy explanations. Walter listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When she finished, he shook his head slowly. "I always knew Sullivan was a hard man," he said quietly. "But to try to kill his own stepdaughter, it defies comprehension." "Will you help us, Walter?" Abigail asked, her voice urgent. "We need food blankets, just enough to last a few days until we can determine our next move." "Of course I'll help," Walter replied without hesitation. "I've watched Sullivan mistreat you for years, powerless to intervene. This at least I can do." Moving with surprising efficiency for a man of his years, Walter gathered supplies from his own modest stores: bread, cheese, dried meat, a small sack of coffee beans, 2 blankets, and a tin mug. "It's not much," he apologized, "but it should sustain you for a few days. I can bring more when these run out." "This is more than enough," Abigail assured him, tears pricking her eyes at his kindness. "Thank you, Walter. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Walter waved away her gratitude. "Your mother was kind to me when few others were. An old piano player with trembling hands isn't worth much in most people's estimation. But Clara, she saw the person, not just the usefulness." His voice softened with memory. "I'm just returning the favor, helping her daughter in her time of need." As Abigail prepared to leave, Walter placed a gnarled hand on her arm. "Wait," he said. "There's something else you should know. Something about your mother." Abigail stilled her attention, captured by the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" Walter hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "In the weeks before she died, your mother asked me to deliver a letter. Said it was important, that it contained truths that needed to be known if anything happened to her." "A letter?" Abigail's heart quickened. "To whom?" "To a man named Samuel Blackwood," Walter replied, watching her face closely for her reaction. She'd heard he had settled in the territory, though she wasn't certain where. "Asked me to make inquiries, find him if I could." Abigail felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "Did you find him, I mean?" Walter shook his head regretfully. "I tried, but information was scarce. By the time I learned he had a ranch outside town, your mother had taken a turn for the worse. And then—" He trailed off, the memory of Clara's death hanging heavy between them. "The letter?" Abigail pressed her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to it?" "I kept it," Walter admitted. "Wasn't sure what else to do. Couldn't deliver it without revealing your mother's confidence. Couldn't destroy what might be her final wishes." He moved to a small trunk in the corner of his room, unlocked it with a key he kept on a chain around his neck, and withdrew a sealed envelope yellowed with age. "I've been carrying this burden for 5 years, waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances." With trembling hands, he extended the letter to Abigail. "I believe this belongs to you now. Or perhaps to Mr. Blackwood. Either way, it's time it reached its intended recipient." Abigail took the envelope reverently, running her fingers over the handwriting she recognized instantly as her mother's elegant, precise, the product of an education that had seemed at odds with her life as a saloon owner's wife. Samuel Blackwood was written on the front, nothing more. "Thank you, Walter," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for keeping this safe all these years, for being a friend to my mother when she needed one." Walter nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "You should go now before the town fully wakes. Be careful, child." Sullivan is not a man to cross lightly." With the precious letter tucked securely among the supplies, Abigail slipped back into the awakening town, her heart pounding with anticipation and trepidation at what truths her mother's final correspondence might contain. Samuel had used the time during Abigail's absence to make the abandoned minister's quarters more habitable. He had cleared away the worst of the dust and cobwebs, checked that the well behind the building was indeed functional, and arranged what little furniture remained: a bed, a table, 2 chairs to maximize the small space. He had even managed to find a few candle stubs in a drawer, providing a potential source of light that would be less noticeable than a fire during daylight hours. Still, as the minutes stretched into an hour, his concern for Abigail grew. He had positioned himself near the window, watching the gradually increasing activity in the town, alert for any sign of trouble or of Abigail's return. When she finally appeared hurrying along the edge of the property with a bundle clutched to her chest, Samuel felt a relief so profound it startled him. In the short time since he had pulled her from the river, this young woman had come to mean more to him than he had allowed anyone to mean in years. Whether she was indeed his daughter or not, he had already committed himself to her safety, her future, her happiness. He opened the door as she approached, ushering her quickly inside. "Any trouble?" he asked, scanning her face for signs of distress. Abigail shook her head, setting her bundle on the table. "None. Walter was alone as I'd hoped. He provided what he could: food, blankets, coffee." "Good." Samuel nodded approvingly. "We can make this last several days if we're careful." Abigail hesitated, then reached into the bundle and withdrew the envelope. "He also gave me this," she said, her voice unsteady. "A letter from my mother to you." Samuel froze, his eyes fixed on the yellowed envelope on the handwriting he would have recognized anywhere. "Clara," he whispered, the name escaping him like a prayer. "Walter said she gave it to him shortly before she died," Abigail explained, holding out the letter. "Asked him to find you, deliver it. But by the time he learned where you were, she was gone." Samuel finished, accepting the envelope with reverent care. He stared at it for a long moment. This tangible connection to the woman he had loved, had mourned, had never truly stopped missing, despite the passage of years. "Do you want privacy?" Abigail asked quietly. "I can step outside." Samuel looked up, meeting her gaze, Clara's eyes looking back at him from a younger face. "No," he said. "Whatever this contains concerns you as much as me. We should read it together." With careful fingers he broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper within. The letter was dated 3 weeks before Clara's death, the handwriting slightly shakier than he remembered evidence of her declining health. Taking a deep breath, Samuel began to read aloud. "My dearest Samuel, if you are reading these words, then 2 things have come to pass. First, that you survived the war and found your way west, as you always said you would. And second, that I am no longer among the living. There is so much I wish I could tell you in person, so many years, to account for, explanations, to offer forgiveness, to beg. But time, it seems, is no longer my ally, and I must trust to this imperfect medium to convey what my heart has held silent for too long. First, and most importantly, our child lives. Our daughter Abigail, born on January 15, 1863, is everything a parent could hope for: strong, intelligent, kind-hearted, with your sense of justice and my stubborn determination. She believes you died in the war, a story Jeremiah insisted upon, and which I, to my eternal shame, allowed to stand. The truth, as always, is more complex. The night the raiders came, the night our home burned, I was taken, not killed, as you must have been told. Jeremiah was among them, though not as a Confederate soldier. He had joined a gang of opportunists using the chaos of war to settle personal scores and profit from others' misfortune. I was brought to a camp deep in the woods, kept there until Abigail was born. I was told you had been killed at Antietam, shown newspaper clippings that seemed to confirm it. In my grief, my isolation with a newborn daughter to protect, I made a devil's bargain with Jeremiah, my cooperation, in exchange for Abigail's safety. He was obsessed with me, had been since our first meeting years before. In his twisted mind, taking me from you was justice for some perceived wrong. I became his wife in name, only maintaining the facade to protect our daughter. When the war ended, he brought us west to this remote place where questions were few and pasts easily fabricated. For years I searched for news of you, hoping against hope that the reports of your death had been false. It wasn't until Reverend Hayes mentioned a new rancher, a former Union surgeon named Blackwood, that I dared to believe you might still live, might be near. Jeremiah suspects nothing of my discovery, but my illness progresses rapidly, and I fear what may happen to Abigail when I am gone. He is not cruel to her, but neither does he love her as a father should. She is a reminder of you, though he doesn't realize how literal that reminder is. If Providence has guided this letter to your hands, I beg you, look after our daughter. She will need protection, guidance, love, all the things I will no longer be able to provide. Tell her the truth when you judge the time is right. And know that despite all appearances, despite the years and distance between us, my heart has always belonged to you. With eternal love, Clara. Samuel's voice faltered on the final words, emotion overwhelming him. He lowered the letter slowly, meeting Abigail's tear-filled eyes. She never stopped loving you, Abigail whispered, her voice choked. All those years with Sullivan, she was protecting me, not choosing him. Samuel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The revelation of Clara's sacrifice, her years of silent suffering, her enduring love, it was almost too much to bear. And Sullivan, Abigail continued, anger beginning to replace her initial shock. He knew, he always knew you were my father. He kept me as a trophy, a final victory over you. It seems so, Samuel agreed, finding his voice at last. Though I suspect his feelings for your mother were genuine in his own twisted way. He couldn't have her heart, so he took her body and her child instead. Abigail rose from her chair, pacing the small room as she processed this new understanding of her life. Her history. Everything makes sense now. Why he always seemed to resent me even while providing for me. Why he reacted so violently when I mentioned Mother that night at the river. She paused, a new realization dawning. And why he's so desperate to find me now. I'm the living proof of his deception, his crime. Samuel carefully refolded the letter, his mind working through the implications, the new pieces of the puzzle that Clara's words had provided. We need to be more careful than ever, he said gravely. Sullivan has more at stake than we realized. If the truth about how he acquired your mother became known, he could hang, Abigail finished. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, those are hanging offenses in the territory. Which makes him all the more dangerous, Samuel concluded. A man with nothing to lose will stop at nothing to protect himself. And they fell silent, each contemplating the gravity of their situation. Outside, the town had fully awakened, the sounds of daily life continuing oblivious to the drama unfolding in the abandoned church quarters. Finally, Abigail spoke, her voice steady, despite the emotion still evident in her eyes. What do we do now that we know the truth? Samuel considered this carefully. We have Clara's letter, evidence of Sullivan's crimes. We could take it to the territorial judge and Helena bypass Sheriff Monroe altogether. That would mean leaving Redemption Valley, Abigail pointed out. Traveling openly through territory, Sullivan controls with Reed and his men searching for us. True, Samuel acknowledged. And even with the letter, it would be your word and mine against Sullivan's, a respected businessman versus a young woman with no standing and a reclusive rancher with a grudge. Abigail's shoulders slumped slightly at this assessment. So we're trapped. We can't stay hidden forever, but we can't openly challenge Sullivan either. Samuel rose, moving to stand beside her at the window. Not trapped, he corrected gently. Just in need of more allies, more evidence. Your mother's letter is a start, but we need to build a stronger case. Who would stand against Sullivan in this town? Samuel thought for a moment. Martha, for one. She has influence connections. Walter, it seems, is already on our side. And there may be people who have suffered under Sullivan's control of the town, who would speak if given the opportunity and protection. Abigail nodded slowly, hope kindling in her expression. So we gather evidence, build support, then present our case to the territorial judge. Exactly, Samuel confirmed. It will take time and it won't be without risk. But it's our best chance for a permanent solution, one that allows you to live freely without looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life. The plan, though fraught with challenges, gave them a direction, a purpose beyond mere survival. They spent the remainder of the day in the abandoned quarters, speaking in hushed tones, sharing the simple food Walter had provided, and most importantly, beginning to know each other as father and daughter. Abigail told Samuel about her childhood, about Clara's quiet strength, and the small acts of resistance against Sullivan's control. Samuel, in turn, shared stories of his life with Clara, before the war, of the dreams they had shared, the future they had planned together. As night fell, they risked a small fire in the fireplace, the chimney drawing properly and dispersing the smoke among the many other chimney plumes rising from the town. The warmth and light created an illusion of normalcy, of safety, that both knew was precarious at best. "We should rest," Samuel suggested, as the fire burned down to embers. "Tomorrow we can begin making discreet inquiries, perhaps send a message to Martha to let her know we're safe." Abigail nodded, settling onto the narrow bed while Samuel arranged the second blanket on the floor nearby. Despite the circumstances, despite the danger that still surrounded them, there was a peace between them now, the peace of truth revealed, of connections, affirmed, of a father and daughter, reunited against all odds. "Samuel," Abigail said softly as sleep began to claim her, "I'm glad it was you. That you're my father, I mean." Samuel turned toward her, his heart full beyond measure at her simple declaration. "And I am more grateful than I can express," he replied, "to have found you at last, Abigail." Outside, the wind had begun to rise, whistling through the damaged section of the church roof, another storm approaching Redemption Valley. But within the small quarters, father and daughter slept, finding in each other's presence a shelter more secure than walls of wood or stone could provide. The next morning dawned gray and threatening, the promised storm gathering force over the mountains to the west. Samuel woke early years of ranch life, having trained his body to rise with the first light, regardless of circumstances. He moved quietly, careful not to disturb Abigail, who still slept soundly, her face peaceful in repose. Their situation remained precarious, but with Clara's letter and the beginnings of a plan, Samuel felt a cautious optimism. Today, they would send word to Martha, perhaps make contact with Walter again to gather information about Sullivan's movements. Small steps toward their goal of exposing Sullivan's crimes and securing Abigail's freedom. A soft knock at the door froze Samuel mid-movement. He glanced at Abigail, who had stirred at the sound, but not yet fully awakened, then moved silently to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the dusty curtains. Walter stood outside alone, his aged face creased with anxiety. Samuel relaxed slightly, though caution kept him alert as he opened the door just wide enough to admit the elderly piano player. "Mr. Blackwood," Walter greeted him in a hushed tone. "Forgive the intrusion, but there's news you need to hear." By now, Abigail had awakened, sitting up and drawing the blanket around her shoulders. "Walter, what is it?" "What's happened?" Walter removed his hat, twisting it nervously in his gnarled hands. "Sullivan knows you're in town," he said without preamble. "One of Reed's men spotted you yesterday morning returning here. They've been watching the building since dawn, waiting for Sheriff Monroe to organize a search party." Samuel muttered a curse under his breath. "How much time do we have?" "Not much," Walter admitted grimly. "Monroe's deputized half a dozen men. They're gathering at the saloon as we speak, receiving their orders from Sullivan." Abigail had risen, her face pale but composed. "We need to leave now, before they surround the building." Samuel nodded, already gathering their meager belongings. "Back to the horses, then, north toward Helena. If we can reach the territorial judge—" "You won't make it," Walter interrupted. "Reed's men are watching the outskirts of town, especially the trail where you left your horses. And the storm." He gestured toward the window, where the first heavy raindrops had begun to splatter against the glass. "It's going to be a bad one. Flash floods in the lowlands, mudslides in the hills." "Then we're trapped," Abigail said, her voice steady, despite the fear evident in her eyes. Walter hesitated, then said, "There might be another way. The old mine shaft on the eastern edge of town. It connects to tunnels that run beneath the ridge, emerging near the old Thompson place, about 3 miles out. Its dangerous parts have collapsed over the years, but it might be your only chance." Samuel considered this option. Mining tunnels were notoriously unstable, especially in this region where proper shoring had often been neglected in the rush to extract ore. But Walter was right with Reed's men watching the obvious escape routes, and a storm making travel over open ground, treacherous the tunnels might offer their best hope. "How do we reach this mine shaft without being seen?" he asked. "There's access through the cellar of the Mercantile," Walter replied. "Old man Greeley used it during the early days to move supplies directly to the miners. The entrance is hidden behind some shelving, but I know where it is. I can show you." "And Greeley, can he be trusted?" Walter shook his head. "Greeley died last winter. His son runs the store now, but he doesn't know about the tunnel. Few people do these days." A plan began to form in Samuel's mind. "We'll need a distraction to get across town to the Mercantile without being spotted." "Leave that to me," Walter said with unexpected determination. "I may be old, but I can still create a commotion when needed." Samuel studied the elderly man, recognizing the courage it had taken for him to come warn them, to offer help that could place him in Sullivan's crosshairs. "We can't ask you to risk yourself further, Walter. You've done enough already." "You're not asking, I'm offering," Walter replied firmly. "Clara was kind to me when others weren't. Her daughter deserves the same consideration. Besides," he added with a wry smile, "at my age, there's not much Sullivan can do to me. That time won't do soon enough anyway." Abigail moved to Walter's side, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Thank you, Walter. We won't forget this." Walter patted her hand. "Just get safely away, child. That will be thanks enough." He turned back to Samuel. "Give me 15 minutes to get back to the saloon, then make your way to the rear entrance of the Mercantile. I'll create a distraction that will draw attention to the main street. With the storm coming, most folks will be indoors anyway." With a final nod, Walter slipped out the door and disappeared around the corner of the building, his slight figure soon lost in the increasingly heavy rain. "Can we trust him?" Samuel asked Abigail, not questioning the man's intentions, but his ability to create an effective distraction. "Completely," Abigail assured him. "Walter may look frail, but he has a spine of steel when it matters. If he says he'll create a distraction, he will." They used the 15 minutes to prepare gathering their few possessions and Clara's precious letter, which Samuel tucked securely inside his shirt. The storm had fully arrived now, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling through the damaged section of the church roof. "Ready?" Samuel asked as the appointed time arrived. Abigail nodded, pulling the makeshift shawl over her head. "Ready." They slipped out the rear door of the building into the teeth of the storm. Rain immediately soaked through their clothing, but it provided a blessing as well. Few people were about those who were hurried with heads down, paying little attention to their surroundings. They had made it halfway to the Mercantile when a commotion erupted on the main street. Raised voices, the crash of breaking glass, and then, incredibly, the sound of piano music. Wild, discordant notes pounded with more enthusiasm than skill. "Walter!" Abigail murmured, a smile tugging at her lips, despite their precarious situation. Through the curtain of rain they could see figures running toward the saloon, where Walter had apparently decided that the best distraction was a one-man riot. Even from this distance, they could hear his voice raised in what seemed to be a drunken tirade against Sullivan, accompanied by the abuse of the saloon's piano. "Now!" Samuel urged, guiding Abigail toward the Mercantile's rear entrance, while attention was focused elsewhere. The door was unlocked, as Walter had promised it would be. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a storage room stacked with crates and barrels. The main shop lay beyond another door, where they could hear a single voice, young Greeley presumably commenting to himself about the commotion outside. "The cellar," Abigail whispered, pointing to a trap door partially hidden beneath a rug. Samuel lifted the door carefully, wincing at the slight creak of hinges. A narrow ladder descended into darkness. He went first, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it, then helped Abigail down after him. The cellar was cool and damp, illuminated only by what little light filtered through the open trapdoor. Samuel struck a match, revealing a space cluttered with more supplies. Flour sacks, preserved goods tools, and against the far wall, a set of shelves loaded with canned goods. "Walter said the entrance is behind shelving," Abigail reminded him, moving carefully between the stacked supplies. It took several minutes of searching before Samuel discovered that one section of shelving was mounted on hinges designed to swing outward to reveal a rough-hewn passage beyond. The entrance was small, requiring them to crouch, but passable. "We should close it behind us," Samuel decided, pulling the shelving back into place once they had entered the tunnel, "in case someone comes down to the cellar." The tunnel was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing Samuel to stoop as they proceeded. He lit another match, revealing earthen walls supported by timber beams at regular intervals, many of which had begun to rot and sag with age and moisture. "Stay close," he instructed Abigail, who followed just behind him. "And watch your step. The ground is uneven." They moved as quickly as caution allowed, aware that their head start might be measured in minutes if Walter's distraction failed to hold attention, or if someone noticed their entry into the Mercantile. The tunnel sloped gradually downward, then leveled out as it apparently joined the main mine shaft. Here the passage widened enough for them to walk upright, though the air grew increasingly stale and heavy with moisture. Water dripped from the ceiling in places, forming puddles on the packed earth floor. Their matches provided only fleeting illumination, each one burning down quickly in the damp air, forcing them to proceed largely by feel in the intervals of darkness. "How much further, do you think?" Abigail asked, after they had been walking for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 20 minutes. "Hard to say," Samuel admitted. Walter mentioned the Thompson place that's about 3 miles from town, but the tunnels likely don't run in a straight line. They pressed on, the silence broken only by their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from above. Several times they reached junctions where the tunnel branched, forcing them to make educated guesses about which path might lead toward their destination. The third such junction presented a more serious challenge. The left-hand passage had partially collapsed, leaving only a narrow crawl space through which they might squeeze. The right-hand tunnel appeared intact, but veered sharply away from what Samuel judged to be their desired direction. The left passage is more direct, he reasoned, but that collapse concerns me. One wrong move and more of the ceiling could come down. But the right passage might take us miles out of our way, Abigail pointed out, or lead to a dead end. We don't have time to backtrack if we're wrong. Samuel studied both options in the flickering light of a match, weighing the risks. Finally, he made his decision. We'll try the left passage. I'll go first, test the stability. If it seems too dangerous, we'll turn back and try the other way. Abigail nodded, trusting his judgment. Samuel approached the partially collapsed section, examining the fallen timbers and rock with care. The opening was barely wide enough for an adult to pass through, and what remained of the ceiling looked precarious at best. Stay here until I'm through, he instructed Abigail. If something happens, if more collapses, take the other passage immediately. Don't wait for me. I'm not leaving you, Abigail replied firmly. Samuel recognized the stubborn set of her jaw, Clara's determination shining through. Abigail, he said gently, I've just found you. I won't risk losing you again, not even to save myself. Promise me. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded reluctantly. I promise, but nothing will happen. We'll both make it through. Samuel squeezed her hand briefly, then turned to face the collapsed section. Dropping to his hands and knees, he began to crawl into the narrow opening, testing each movement, carefully alert for any sign of shifting debris above. The passage was tighter than it had appeared, forcing him to wriggle forward on his stomach in places. Twice he had to stop and carefully shift small rocks that blocked his way, each time holding his breath, as he listened for the ominous sounds of settling earth that might precede a further collapse. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, he emerged on the other side where the tunnel widened again and the ceiling appeared more stable. He called back to Abigail. It's passable, but be extremely careful. Move slowly and stay low. He watched anxiously as she began her own crawl through the tight space, her smaller frame navigating the obstacles with greater ease than he had. She was nearly through when a new sound reached them, distant at first, then growing clearer. Voices echoing through the tunnels behind them. They've found the entrance, Abigail whispered, her eyes wide with fear as she emerged from the collapsed section. They're following us. Quickly then, Samuel urged, helping her to her feet. We need to put as much distance between us and them as possible. They hurried forward, no longer taking the time to light matches at regular intervals, moving by touch along the damp walls, stumbling occasionally on the uneven floor, but pressing on with desperate determination. The voices behind them grew fainter as they continued deeper into the mine, suggesting they had gained some ground on their pursuers. Just as Samuel began to hope they might have escaped, they rounded a bend in the tunnel and found themselves facing a sheet of water. The passage ahead was flooded, the ceiling dipping low enough that the water nearly reached it, leaving no space to continue. The storm, Samuel realized aloud. Flash, flooding from the surface, finding its way into the lower tunnels. What do we do? Abigail asked, her voice remarkably steady despite their dire situation. Go back, try the other passage. No time, Samuel said grimly. They'd catch us before we made it back to the junction. He studied the flooded section, trying to gauge its extent. This might not extend too far. These old mines often have drainage systems to prevent exactly this kind of flooding. You mean swim through? Abigail looked dubious. It's our only option, Samuel confirmed. I'll go first test the distance. If it's too far, I'll return, and we'll think of something else. Before Abigail could protest, Samuel had waded into the water, which quickly rose to his chest, then his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, he ducked beneath the surface, pushing forward into the flooded tunnel. The water was shockingly cold, the visibility non-existent in the absolute darkness. Samuel propelled himself forward by one hand brushing the ceiling to guide his direction, the other stretched ahead to detect any obstacles. His lungs began to burn as he swam the distance, proving greater than he had hoped. Just as he was about to turn back, his outstretched hand felt open space ahead. The tunnel ceiling rose again, allowing air. With a final surge of effort, Samuel broke the surface, gasping, relieved to find himself in a section where only the lower portion of the tunnel was flooded. After catching his breath, he called back to Abigail, his voice echoing strangely off the water's surface. It's passable, about 20 feet of swimming. Then the ceiling rises again. I'm coming, Abigail's voice returned, followed by the sound of splashing as she entered the water. Samuel waited anxiously, counting the seconds, ready to dive back if she didn't appear within a reasonable time. But soon her head broke the surface beside him, her gasping breaths turning to relieved laughter as she realized they had both made it through. I hope our pursuers aren't strong swimmers, she said as they waded through the now shallower water, which gradually receded as the tunnel floor began to slope upward. Even if they are, it will slow them down, Samuel replied. And they won't know for certain that we came this way. They might waste time exploring other passages first. They continued on their sodden clothing, adding to the discomfort of the journey, but their spirits buoyed by the successful navigation of the flooded section. The tunnel began to change character, the walls now showing veins of quartz among the darker rock, evidence that they had entered the actual mining portion of the complex. After perhaps another half-hour of walking, a faint glow appeared ahead, not the yellow flame of a lantern, but the grayish light of day filtering through an opening. They had reached the exit. Approaching cautiously, they found themselves facing a narrow fissure in the rock face, partially concealed by brush, but large enough to squeeze through. Beyond lay a rain-soaked landscape, a small valley surrounded by wooded hills. In the distance, through the curtain of rain, they could just make out a weathered structure, the Thompson place Walter had mentioned. We made it, Abigail breathed, relief evident in her voice. Now what? Samuel surveyed their surroundings, calculating distances and options. The Thompson place first, to get out of this storm and reconsider our situation. Then, if it's safe, we head for Helena. The territorial judge is our best hope for justice now. Abigail nodded her agreement, and together they stepped out of the mine entrance and into the rain-swept valley, leaving the darkness of the tunnels behind, but moving toward an uncertain future that promised both danger and the possibility of justice long deferred. Behind them, deep in the earth, their pursuers faced the flooded section of tunnel, unknowing whether their quarry had passed this way or perished in the attempt. And in Redemption Valley, Jeremiah Sullivan waited, his rage building as reports came back of the fugitives' escape, his determination to silence them forever growing with each passing hour. The storm that had aided their flight continued to build, lightning splitting the sky as thunder rolled across the valley, nature's own acknowledgement of the conflict that was reaching its inevitable climax, a final reckoning between past and present, truth and deception, justice and retribution. For Abigail and Samuel, the journey had only just begun. The rain pounded against their backs as they made their way toward the Thompson place, Father and daughter united by blood, by truth revealed, and by a shared determination to claim the future that had been denied them for too long. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Their bond forged in the crucible of danger and discovery, stronger now than Sullivan's hatred or the storms of circumstance could ever break. "We'll make it," Samuel said, not as a hope but as a promise, his hand firm on Abigail's shoulder as they walked into the heart of the storm. Together. Abigail's smile, so reminiscent of Clara's, was answer enough. In that moment, despite the rain and wind, despite the dangers still pursuing them, despite the uncertain path ahead, they had found what mattered most, each other, and the truth that set them free.